Story 1.
Hello, my name is Michael Reed, and I run a channel that has recently become a cult favorite among horror and mystery enthusiasts. Every week, I venture into the creepiest places to share their stories and show you what lurks in the darkness and shadows. This project is not just a job for me. It's my life. Today, I want to share an announcement that will make your heart race. Soon, I will be heading to one of the scariest places I have ever heard of. The old St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital, located on the outskirts of Willow Creek, Massachusetts. St. Mary's was closed over 60 years ago, and since then, there have been rumors of strange and unexplained phenomena occurring there at night. People living nearby tell stories of eerie screams and ghostly figures seen through the broken windows. The hospital's history is full of dark secrets and tragic events, and I intend to uncover them for you. Prepare yourselves, because in the coming days, we will venture into this sinister place together. I will bring cameras, flashlights, and all the necessary equipment to capture every detail and not miss a single moment. We will walk through the corridors, peek into the wards, and discover what lies behind doors that may not have been opened in a long time. Follow my channel, subscribe, and don't miss this thrilling journey into the heart of a nightmarish place. True horrors await us, and I'm ready to share them with you. See you soon at St. Mary's, my friends. I hope you're ready for what we'll find there. After finishing the recording, I turned off the camera and exhaled with relief. Everything was going smoothly. My viewers would get exactly what they were expecting, and I would take another step toward my big success. St. Mary's was brought to my attention by my acquaintance Jake. He stumbled upon one of my videos and decided to help me with an idea for my next video. "Dude, this place is really creepy. If anything happens to you, don't blame me. I warned you," he said, and there was genuine concern in his voice. I was skeptical of his words, but did some research anyway. It turned out that St. Mary's indeed had a dark history, but such stories don't scare me. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, all nonsense made up by people to instill fear. I'm used to darkness and scary stories. It was time to start preparing. Grabbing my backpack, I began carefully packing everything I needed, checking each item twice. There were a few hours left until evening, and the road to Willow Creek would take some time. I needed to hurry. After preparing everything, I quickly grabbed a bite to avoid distractions from hunger during the shoot. I checked the route on the map to avoid unnecessary delays. The closer it got to departure time, the more I felt a slight excitement. Throwing on my jacket and grabbing my car keys, I took one last look at the equipment list, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. I loaded my gear into the car's trunk, ensuring it was securely fastened so nothing would fall out during the journey. Once I was sure everything was in place, I got behind the wheel and started the engine. The road to Willow Creek began with the busy streets of my hometown. I drove onto the I-95, which stretched along the Atlantic coast, past dense forests and small towns in New England. In the evening twilight filtering through the thick trees, the highway seemed like an endless ribbon leading into the unknown. After about an hour of driving, I turned onto a narrower road that led deeper into the state. As I approached Willow Creek, the landscape became wilder and more desolate. In the distance, I saw the silhouettes of old barns and abandoned houses, each looking like a scene from an old horror movie. Driving through the small town of Deerfield, where time seemed to have stood still, I crossed the Connecticut River via an old bridge. Here, the road became increasingly winding and narrow. The sky began to darken, and only my car's headlights illuminated the path. The forest surrounding the road seemed impenetrable, and the tree branches leaning over the road created the feeling of driving through a tunnel. Finally, I arrived in Willow Creek, a quiet town hidden among the hills and forests of Massachusetts. The narrow streets and old buildings created an atmosphere of abandonment and tranquility. In the town center stood an old church with a bell tower, reminiscent of times long gone. St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital was located on the town's outskirts. Turning onto Willow Street, I saw it, a massive building hidden behind thick overgrowth and a high metal fence. Stopping the car in front of the entrance, I turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment. In front of me loomed the ominous silhouette of the hospital, seemingly frozen in anticipation. The old brick walls were covered in ivy and moss, giving the hospital the appearance of an abandoned castle. The windows, broken and boarded up, looked at me with empty eyes through which the wind whistled lightly inside. The scale of the place was overwhelming. 3 floors of dark corridors and wards, each holding its own stories and secrets. The main entrance was adorned with massive oak doors. The old metal gates, half covered in rust, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me to enter. I sighed, realizing that a challenging night lay ahead. As I pulled the equipment from the trunk, I couldn't help but think of those who once lived here. Fragments of Jake's stories surfaced in my memory. Screams, ghosts, locked doors that opened on their own. But I was here to show that these were just legends. Gathering everything I needed, I approached the main entrance. Setting up the cameras on tripods, I carefully checked the angles to capture as many details as possible. They had to record every sound, every shadow, so that viewers could judge for themselves what was happening here. With a handheld tripod and a small camera mounted on it, I set up the equipment for live streaming. The flashlight in my other hand cast trembling beams of light on the walls and floor, creating strange shadows. I started the stream and looked into the lens, trying to appear confident. Hi, everyone. This is Michael Reed, and we're standing at the threshold of St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital. As I promised, tonight we'll spend the night in this abandoned place, full of mysteries and secrets. St. Mary's history is filled with horrors and tragedies, and I'm ready to share this night with you. But before we enter, I'll tell you a scary story. St. Mary's was founded in 1924 as a refuge for people with mental illnesses. Back then, no one knew that within a few decades, it would become one of the most notorious places in Massachusetts. The first years, the hospital functioned as a regular medical facility. Doctors and nurses worked here, striving to help their patients. But everything changed in 1952, when the first of a series of strange and horrific incidents occurred. In the fall of that year, one of the patients, a young man named Jacob Morris, suddenly disappeared. His ward was found completely destroyed. Furniture overturned, walls and floors covered in deep scratches. Jacob was never found. A few weeks later, another patient, a woman named Alice Harper, was found dead in her chair. Her body was covered in numerous ragged wounds, as if she had been torn apart by a wild animal. The hospital's doctors and staff were shocked, not understanding how such a thing could happen inside a well-guarded building. At night, strange sounds began to echo in St. Mary's corridors. Dull thuds, rustling, and eerie howls. Patients and staff started reporting seeing figures in the shadows that could not belong to a human. Many of those who worked the night shift claimed to hear footsteps, heavy breathing, and sometimes even growling emanating from dark corners and empty rooms. With each passing month, the fear among staff and patients grew. New disappearances and strange deaths began occurring in the hospital. People saw shadows flitting past windows, heard screams coming from empty rooms. Some patients claimed they were attacked by something they couldn't fully see but could only feel. Cold breath on their skin. Sudden movements in the dark. The hospital administration tried to cover up these incidents, attributing everything to the madness of the patients. But among the staff, rumors spread about some kind of beast lurking in the hospital. More and more people began to believe that these were not mere coincidences, but something more sinister dwelling within the walls of St. Mary's S. All these strange occurrences reached their climax in 1953 when the hospital was suddenly closed. The official version stated that the closure was due to funding issues and the deteriorating condition of the building. But those who worked there knew the true reason was far more terrifying. They left, abandoning St. Mary's and its dreadful secrets and unsolved mysteries. Now I am here, among these walls, trying to understand what really happened in this place. Perhaps tonight will provide us with answers to many questions. So stay with me, and let's try to uncover the mysteries of St. Mary's together. Finishing my speech, I approached the massive oak door leading into the building and tried to open it. But it was locked with a rusty old padlock. This was not unexpected, considering how many years this place had stood abandoned. I looked around, holding the camera on a handheld tripod to continue the live stream. "Looks like the main entrance is a no-go," I said, addressing my viewers. "But don't worry, there's always another way in." I circled the building, shining my flashlight on the windows, and soon found one that was broken. The glass was already gone, leaving only sharp shards around the frame. I carefully moved them aside, trying not to cut myself, and climbed inside, continuing the stream. And here we are, inside, I continued as my feet touched the dusty floor. Let's see what awaits us. I found myself in a small room that likely once served as a service corridor. Narrow walls, peeling paint, and the marks of time were everywhere. Dust rose in clouds with each step I took. I headed towards the door at the end of the corridor and gently pushed it open. It creaked loudly, and I found myself in the hall. The hall was spacious, with a high ceiling and remnants of once majestic stucco. Debris from furniture, broken glass, and trash were scattered everywhere. Old leather chairs, covered in thick layers of dust, lined the walls as if waiting for their long-gone occupants. In the center of the room stood a massive wooden table with old magazines and newspapers, yellowed with age. Several portraits on the walls depicted doctors and the hospital's founders, their faces looking eerie in the light of my flashlight. "And here's the hall of St. Mary S," I said, panning the camera around to show my viewers the scene. Once, this place welcomed patients, administered treatments, and perhaps even saved lives. Now it's a haven for ghosts of the past. Standing in the hall, I continued the stream, showing my viewers every corner of this eerie place. On the central table, I noticed a stack of old medical records and journals. I picked up one of the records, carefully leafing through the pages covered in dust and yellowed by time. "Check this out, folks," I said, holding the record closer to the camera. It mentioned strange symptoms in patients: nightmares, hallucinations, sudden fits of rage. These aren't just ordinary mental disorders. I flipped through the records, finding more entries describing mysterious and frightening symptoms. The journals contained articles by doctors discussing these anomalies and their possible causes. I continued my exploration and pointed the camera at the walls and doors. In the light of the flashlight, deep scratches and signs of struggle became visible. "Folks, take a look at this," I said, showing the viewers the scenes on the walls. Deep scratches as if someone or something was trying to break free. And these signs of struggle, they're everywhere. I walked along the wall, carefully examining each detail. The doors also bore claw marks, reminding me of an inhuman force that dwelled here. These scratches couldn't have been made by ordinary people. This is clearly something more powerful and wild. Taking a few more steps, I stopped in front of one of the doors, which was particularly damaged. See this door? It's completely torn apart. Someone was really desperate to get out of here. It's incredible. I continued recording, trying to keep my voice calm and confident. But even for me, someone used to creepy places. These deep scratches and signs of struggle were slightly unnerving. Maintaining the stream, I cautiously walked through the broken door. The next room was in chaos. Dusty remnants of old furniture were scattered everywhere, broken tables and chairs littering the floor. In one corner stood a long dead lamp covered in cobwebs. Along the walls hung cracked posters with medical diagrams and instructions. On one of the tables, covered in a thick layer of dust, I noticed an old, yellowed photograph. "Folks, look at this," I said, picking up the photograph and showing it to the camera. "It's a picture of a group of doctors. It's signed Project Beast with the date 1952. It looks like these were the people conducting experiments here." Feeling a growing sense of excitement, I continued examining the room. My viewers were intrigued, and I knew I couldn't stop there. Carefully inspecting the space, I noticed a door with a sign that read, "Research Laboratory." It was locked, and I couldn't open it. "We can't get through here, the door is locked," I commented, showing the sign to the viewers. "But I'm sure there's something important inside." Without wasting time, I began checking the desks in the adjacent room. One of them was slightly ajar, and I decided to check the drawers. In one of them, I found an old, dusty keycard. "It looks like we've struck gold," I said, holding the keycard up to the camera. "This might help us unlock the laboratory door." Using the found keycard, I carefully opened the door marked Research Laboratory. Continuing the stream, I stepped inside and found myself in a dark room filled with the smell of old metal and dust. The beams of my flashlight revealed rows of shelves lined with empty and broken test tubes. Old medical instruments, rusty and lost in the chaos, were scattered everywhere. I panned the camera around the room, showing my viewers all these eerie details. "And here we are in the lab," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look at these test tubes and instruments. They haven't been used in ages, but once, experiments were conducted here." On one of the tables, I noticed a stack of old documents and journals. Moving closer, I began flipping through them, trying to find something significant. Soon, my attention was caught by one journal that stood out from the rest. Its pages were filled with doctors' notes describing the experiments they conducted. "Folks, this is incredible," I continued, holding the journal up to the camera. "It describes experiments with a serum supposedly capable of curing mental disorders. But judging by these notes, the serum caused something far more terrifying: beastly transformations." I slowly turned the pages, reading aloud the most frightening excerpts. The doctor's notes described how patients subjected to the serum began exhibiting strange and aggressive behavior. Each day their condition worsened, and soon they became more like wild animals than humans. "According to these records, the doctors tried to hide the consequences of their experiments," I said, feeling the rising tension transmitted to my viewers. "But everything spiraled out of control. This explains the scratches and signs of struggle we saw earlier." Each page of the journal added new details to the horrific events that took place in St. Marius. I realized these experiments could be the reason behind all the strange and eerie occurrences that were rumored. This place indeed holds many secrets and terrifying stories, I concluded, setting the journal aside. And we are on the brink of uncovering one of the most horrifying secrets of this hospital. As I continued through the laboratory, I noticed a large safe in the corner of the room. Its door was slightly ajar, and the lock had clearly been tampered with. I moved closer and cautiously opened it to see what was inside. "Folks, take a look at this," I said, pointing the camera at the safe. It seems someone has already tried to get to the contents of this safe. Inside, I found several folders and documents, many of which were heavily damaged by time. Among them was one folder that stood out labeled Jacob Morris. I carefully pulled it out and began examining its contents. "These are documents about a patient named Jacob Morris," I commented. "According to the records, he was subjected to the experiments and then disappeared. Here, his symptoms and behavior after receiving the serum are described in detail. The doctor's records detailed how Jacob's condition deteriorated after the experiments began. He became increasingly aggressive and uncontrollable, and his body began to undergo strange changes. Eventually, one of the records mentioned his sudden disappearance from a locked ward, causing panic among the doctors. "This is just incredible," I said, showing the records to the viewers. "It seems Jacob Morris was one of the first patients subjected to these horrific experiments." As I studied the documents, my eyes fell on a map at the bottom of the safe. I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a blueprint of the hospital's basement floor, with several rooms marked. "So we have a map of the basement floor," I continued. "It looks like the most secret experiments took place down there. We need to head down and find out what's hidden in these basements." With the map in hand, I began following the path marked on it. Leading the stream, I carefully looked around, trying not to miss any detail. Soon I found the corridor indicated on the map, leading to the basement. The door at the end looked massive and old with visible rust marks. "Here it is, the way to the basement," I said, showing the door to the viewers. "It looks like it hasn't been opened in years." I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Applying more force and pushing hard, I finally heard the old hinges creak, and the door slowly began to open. "It looks like we're in," I commented, taking the first step inside. "Get ready for what we might find down there." Descending the narrow, steep staircase, I directed the flashlight downward, illuminating the steps and walls. With each step, I noticed more signs of struggle. Deep scratches on the walls and steps, dark stains that could have been blood. "Just look at this," I said, showing the viewers the eerie details. Terrible things clearly happened here. The corridor I was walking through was narrow and grim, lit only by my flashlight. The shadows from every movement seemed ominous, and the sounds echoed off the empty walls. I noticed traces on the floor and walls indicating a fierce struggle, pieces of cloth, tufts of fur, and bloodstains. "These marks couldn't have been made by ordinary people," I continued, holding the camera steadily. "This might be evidence of those beastly transformations we read about." As I descended further, I began to feel the cold air enveloping me. The surroundings grew quieter, with only the sound of my footsteps and my breathing breaking the dead silence. With each step, the tension mounted, and I realized that ahead might lie answers to all the questions, but also new horrors. "We're almost there," I said, as the stairs finally ended, revealing a long corridor with several doors. According to the map, The most secret rooms are here. Walking down the basement corridor, I started noticing old metal cages and isolation cells for patients. These places were meant for the most dangerous or unruly patients, and their condition only confirmed that. The doors of the cells were covered in deep scratches, and dark stains on the floor and walls hinted at possible blood. "Guys, look at these cells," I said, directing the camera at the gruesome details. These places were clearly used to hold patients who were dangerous to themselves and others. As I passed by one of the cells, I noticed that its door was slightly ajar. Cautiously pushing it open, I stepped inside. It was dark and cold. On the floor lay scraps of clothing and tufts of fur. In the corner, I spotted an old, tattered notebook. Picking it up, I saw that it was a diary. "There's something here," I said, showing it to the viewers. "This is Elizabeth Watson's diary. Let's see what she wrote." I began reading the diary aloud, illuminating its pages with my flashlight. October 15th, 1952. Today we admitted a new patient, Jacob Morris. The doctors say he volunteered for an experiment with a new serum. No one says what it does, but the atmosphere is tense. October 20th, 1952. Jacob is behaving strangely. He's become aggressive and unpredictable. The doctors say it's a temporary side effect of the treatment, but his screams at night are unsettling. October 25th, 1952. Heard horrible noises from his cell last night. It sounded like a beast roaring. Checked in the morning. The door is covered in scratches. Jacob says he remembers nothing. October 30th, 1952. Today, Jacob attacked a doctor. He was moved to isolation. I saw his eyes. They looked like a beast's. He was growling and trying to break free. This is not a man, it's a creature. November 3rd, 1952. The doctors say the experiment is out of control. Jacob has turned into a beast. He tore another patient apart. We're all scared. There are fewer doctors now. November 10th, 1952. Jacob disappeared. No one knows how he got out of the cell. We hear him at night. He roams the corridors and his screams are getting closer. It's not safe here. November 15th, 1952. I'm the only one left. Everyone else either ran away or died. I hear him now. He's near. If someone finds this diary, no, don't come here. He's still here. I froze, closing the diary and surveying the dark cell. The nurse's descriptions were horrifying and detailed, giving a clear sense that Jacob Morris had indeed transformed into something inhuman, a creature that continued to haunt these corridors. "This is unbelievable," I said, feeling a chill down my spine. "This diary confirms our worst fears. The doctors created something horrific, and this creature might still be here." After reading, I felt a cognitive dissonance. I couldn't understand if someone was playing a prank on me. Perhaps my friend had planted all these things, or was I being watched by a hidden camera? In all my career, I had never encountered anything like this. But what if the diary was true? I had seen the marks that might confirm these records. I thought to myself, is this place dangerous? Should I leave? I pulled out my phone and checked my stream. I saw numerous comments and a rapidly growing number of views. This was a success, and it motivated me to continue, despite the fear growing inside me. "Guys, this is just incredible," I said on the stream. "I can't stop now. We need to uncover the whole truth about what happened here." Gathering all my resolve, I continued exploring. As I moved further down the corridor, I noticed something unusual. A small cabinet standing flush against the wall. It looked out of place, as if it had been put there to hide something. I cautiously moved it and discovered a small door behind it. "Look at this," I said, showing the hidden door to the viewers. "This looks like a secret entrance. We need to check it out." Carefully opening the door, I entered a small room that turned out to be an office. On the table were papers, old photographs, and several torn diary fragments. I approached the table and began examining the diary fragments. They were the records of the chief doctor, detailing the history of the experiments and their catastrophic results. September 1st, 1947. My name is Dr. Thomas Edwards, Chief Physician at St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital. My career began at Harvard Medical School, where I specialized in neuropsychiatry. After graduation, I worked at various medical institutions, studying the nature of mental illnesses and the possibilities for their treatment. February 10th, 1949. Inspired by the research of Dr. Ernst Schaefer, conducted in the 1930s in Germany, I decided to find a way to treat mental disorders using a serum. Schaefer claimed that animal instincts could be used to strengthen the human mind. His work on the effects of hormones on animal behavior was revolutionary and gave me the idea for my own research. June 20th, 1950. I turned to the work of Dr. Stanislav Brzezinski, who studied the effects of animal hormones on human behavior. His research showed that certain compounds could enhance instinctive reactions. Brzezinski discovered that extracts from the animal pituitary gland, such as adrenocorticotropic hormone, could significantly affect human behavior. October 1st, 1952. I received a research grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. My goal was to develop a serum that could not only suppress mental disorders, but also use the body's internal reserves to treat them. My colleagues at St. Mary's supported my idea, and we began work. October 5th, 1952. We began developing the serum based on Brzezinski and Schaefer's data. The formula included extracts from animal pituitary glands, stimulating the production of adrenaline and other hormones affecting aggression and instincts. We believed this approach could open new horizons in treating severe mental illnesses. October 10th, 1952. Initial animal trials of the serum showed promising results. We observed significant improvement in cognitive functions and a reduction in symptoms of depression. However, there were also side effects such as increased aggression and altered behavior. Despite the risks, we decided to continue our research. October 15th, 1952. It was decided to start human trials. The serum was supposed to help patients with severe mental disorders. We believed that controlled application could bring positive results. It was a risk, but the potential for success seemed significant. October 25th, 1952. Results started to manifest. Patients showed improvement in behavior, but aggressive tendencies also increased. We tried to minimize doses, but it didn't always help. All this time, I felt that we were on the brink of a major discovery, but also on the edge of a precipice. October 30th, 1952. Complications began to escalate. I saw changes in the patients that I couldn't explain. Each day, it became more evident that the serum had not only therapeutic but also transforming effects. I began to doubt the rightness of our path, but it was too late to turn back. November 5th, 1952. It's a disaster. All our attempts to fix the situation failed. I see that the experiment has failed. I take full responsibility for all the deaths and destruction caused by my actions. I cannot live with this burden on my conscience. Let my mistakes serve as a warning to others. I got chills from reading this. Damn, could this all be true? When I finished reading aloud, I pulled out my phone and checked the stream. The comments were exploding. Most of them said, "Dude, get out of there!" Or, "Do you think he'll survive? Place your bets?" Reading these messages and seeing my numbers soar, I realized things were going well and I had to keep going. The viewer's attention was at its peak, and it motivated me to move forward despite the growing fear. I noticed a small door at the end of the room. I approached and opened it. To my horror, I saw a closet inside, and in the middle hung a skeleton suspended by the neck. I recoiled in shock, still filming. "Holy crap," I whispered, realizing I really needed to get out of here. I started making my way to the exit when I suddenly heard a loud crash and a growl. Turning around, I saw something big and menacing in the shadows. My heart raced faster. The shadow stepped into the light and I finally understood. It was a werewolf. A huge creature with a muscular body covered in thick dark fur. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its claws and teeth were enormous and sharp. "Oh my God, it really exists!" I shouted into the stream, keeping the camera on the werewolf. The werewolf lunged at me. I managed to grab a metal pipe lying nearby and struck it hard on the head. The beast recoiled, growling in pain. This gave me only a few seconds. I ran down the corridor trying to find the exit as quickly as possible. The werewolf chased me, and its heavy steps echoed through the empty halls. My heart pounded furiously, and I knew I only had moments to escape. I noticed a small room to the side and without hesitation dashed inside. Quickly entering, I quietly closed the door behind me. My breath was ragged and my heart pounded in my ears. Hiding in the corner of the room behind an old table, I tried to control my breathing to avoid giving myself away. My lungs were gasping for air, and I realized that any movement could be fatal. Suddenly, I heard the werewolf approach the door. Its heavy breathing and growling were clearly audible. It walked past, but then stopped as if it sensed something. For a moment that felt like an eternity, it stood at the door, its shadow flickering in the narrow gap. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The werewolf looked around, its claws scraping the floor, creating a horrifying sound. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed the werewolf would hear it any moment. After several agonizing seconds, the beast growled again and moved further down the corridor. I slowly exhaled, realizing how incredibly lucky I was. Sitting in the corner of the room, I looked around and noticed old medical instruments and chemicals on the shelves. Deciding that I needed something for protection, I began gathering materials to make an improvised weapon. "I need something to protect myself," I whispered to the stream, showing the viewers my actions. I found a bottle of alcohol that hadn't evaporated over the years, likely because it was sealed, and several glass flasks. Using the medical instruments, I carefully mixed the chemicals, creating an incendiary mixture. It smelled horrible, but it should burn well. It was a crude Molotov cocktail with medical elements that intensified the ignition. "This should work," I said, finishing my improvisation. "I hope this will stop it, even if just for a while." Taking several deep breaths, I decided to leave the room. Quietly making my way down the corridor, I tried not to make a sound. My heart was racing, and each step felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. Turning around, I saw the werewolf slowly stalking me. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and I realized I had no time to think. "Damn, it's here," I whispered into the camera, feeling fear paralyze every movement. The werewolf suddenly lunged at me. I quickly lit the mixture and threw it at the beast. The flask shattered, and flames instantly engulfed it. The werewolf roared in pain and fury, burning brightly. Without wasting a second, I ran toward the exit. Most windows were boarded up, and I frantically searched for a way out. Behind me, the roars and growls of the enraged werewolf echoed. Finally, I found an unboarded window. Running to it, I broke the glass and managed to jump outside. Only then did I realize I was on the second floor. I fell, not even having time to comprehend how I ended up on this level. The impact with the ground was hard. I felt a sharp pain in my leg and screamed, realizing I had probably broken it. "Damn my leg," I screamed, lying on the ground trying to cope with the pain. Lifting my head, I saw the werewolf in the window looking down at me. Its eyes burned with rage, and it was clearly preparing to jump after me. I thought it was the end for me. But suddenly, I heard the sound of police sirens on the road. It was like a last-minute rescue. How did they get here? I whispered to myself. Then I remembered. Maybe one of the viewers had called the police. I was incredibly grateful for that. Looking up again, I saw the werewolf already halfway out the window. I started crawling, trying to save myself, when I heard a dull thud. It had landed on the ground not far from me. Turning my head, I saw the beast slowly creeping toward me. It was wounded and covered in burns, but still dangerous. I thought it was the end when suddenly shots rang out and police shouting ensued. "What the hell is that?" one of the officers shouted, continuing to fire. The gunfire continued, and each shot caused significant damage to the creature. The werewolf howled in pain and eventually ran off, leaving a trail of blood. "Clear, clear!" one of the officers shouted, running up to me. "Are you okay?" I felt several pairs of hands lifting me. The pain in my leg was unbearable, but the realization that I was saved brought relief. "Yeah, but I think my leg is broken," I mumbled, feeling myself being carefully carried to the car. The officers called for medics, who quickly arrived on the scene. They carefully stabilized my leg, applied a splint, and gave me painkillers to ease the pain. All the while, I tried to process what had happened. "How did you know?" I asked as they carried me to the ambulance. "Someone called us with the address, saying a person was in danger," the officer replied with a smile. "But what the hell was that thing?" he asked. I just nodded. Soon I was loaded into the ambulance, and I felt the pain begin to subside thanks to the administered medicine. My thoughts were still scattered, but I felt grateful and relieved. At the hospital, they took x-rays, confirming the broken leg. The doctor set it in a cast and ensured I had no other serious injuries. The police stayed with me the entire time, trying to offer support. "You're one lucky guy," one of them said, sitting next to me. "Not many can say they survived an encounter with a creature like that." "Yeah, I still can't fully believe it," I replied, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." The officers told me they would continue investigating the case and that all the footage from my stream would be reviewed to determine all the circumstances. Finally alone in the hospital room, I remembered the stream. Pulling out my phone, I addressed the viewers. "Guys, thank you for being with me tonight. Thanks to you, I'm here and safe. I'm ending the stream here, but I promise to come back with new stories. Be careful and take care of yourselves." Ending the stream, I placed the phone on the table and realized how lucky I was. I was alive, despite all the horrors I had faced. Closing my eyes, I tried to sleep, knowing this night had changed my life forever.
Story 2.
The tall, gloomy hall, adorned with woven tapestries depicting moments of heroic legends and various victorious battle scenes, could not alleviate his loneliness. The carved fireplace with barely glowing embers failed to warm his frozen limbs. The sparse furniture, appearing small and almost unreal, only added to the sense of desolation and abandonment. He despised this hall. Why then had he been sitting here for 5 hours straight when he could have left this cold and gloomy refuge long ago? As soon as the heavy creaking door, adorned with intricate carvings and twists, opened and the girl with chestnut curls and a mischievous face dashed in, the heiress to all conceivable and inconceivable riches, both magical and physical. Selena, the last of the line of white fire mages. She could have been a good wife and mother to his children, but she drenched him in contempt. Her anger and hatred pelted him from head to toe like hail. He had the right to feel beaten, humiliated, and practically destroyed, at least until the sun set. Then his powerful paws would carry the huge, shaggy beast to the limits of his domain, to freedom, to the moon, to uncharted paths. Perhaps history is right. This is the only love available to him, the only joy that won't reject or deceive him, the only loyalty he can count on. A persistent image spins in his mind's eye, a small round woman with a doughy face, squinty eyes and plump lips resembling a fancy pastry, sinking into a deep armchair, shrieking something about destiny and necessity. The end of her tirade is lost in a deep, guttural cough, which the gentleman sitting across from her tries to mask with a contemptuous laugh. Where this scene comes from and what it means now, he can't recall. But it disturbs and awakens his dozing consciousness. If he focuses on this scene, it becomes clear that it's not a fictional image, but a memory. Of course. There he is, a 10-year-old boy in a satin suit standing, hiding behind heavy curtains. His outfit is so overloaded with ruffles, bows, ties, and buttons that he resembles a wedding cake. The image of a caramelized sugar man is completed by his meticulously combed, curled, and pomaded dark blonde hair. He was terribly annoyed by what they did to him every morning, but he didn't dare argue. He shouldn't have been there. He ended up there by accident. He ran into the library, escaping another decoration concocted by some nanny. For some reason, they all thought that adorning him this way would bring pleasure to his parents' faces. However, his father only frowned, and his mother sighed heavily and sent him back to the nursery to change. "You need to have a serious talk with her." He heard his father's words just as he was about to leave. "And if she doesn't listen again, dismiss her. I can't just throw her out." The end of his mother's sentence was drowned out by the closing door. That's how he understood that there was some discord between his parents. His father was displeased, and that displeasure was caused by him. When the nanny found out why the young lord had returned, she threw up her hands and was offended, as if it were his fault that her efforts went unappreciated. This time, too, they sent him to change, but he hid here and fell asleep, exhausted from the tugging, running, and the nanny's constant whining and grumbling. Hearing voices, he woke up instantly, and while he was thinking about what to do, it was already too late to come out. "Well, what can we do, dear?" Individual phrases spoken in a languid, syrupy voice resurfaced in his memory. "We warned Lilia, but she was always willful. I would even say, impossibly stubborn. She wanted to have a boy. And what are we to do with this child now?" "Hector," she called out petulantly, spilling out of the armchair like dough from a pot. "Hector, do you hear me? Soon it will manifest, and what will we do?" She emphasized the word "it." He emerged from the depths of memory, responding to a demanding call. The rustling of starched skirts resounded in the hall's silence like a stormy squall. The time when it sounded cozy, like the sound of a gentle summer rain, had passed. "Couldn't you wait?" A sharp, angry voice echoed. It cut through the air like a knife through resisting flesh. He would have liked to resist, but there was no chance. "Lying is my middle name, isn't it? Mother?" A bitterness and irritation seeped through his even, colorless voice. A tall, thin woman with a hawk-like face, annoyed, shrugged, and moved to the window, trying to make out something in the approaching twilight. Long, fluffy eyelashes framing her steel-gray eyes were the only remnants of her lost gentleness. If she could, she would turn them into steel spikes. "I want this all to end just as much as you do," she said with barely noticeable weariness. Her thin lips twisted in an attempt to suppress a sigh. "What is it?" Turning away from the window, she looked at him with a haughty gaze, as if trying to read some hidden message he deliberately concealed behind a simple question, and was already preemptively trying to catch him in impudence or disrespect, or something else. Her mind had a rich arsenal of reproaches. Yet once, it was different. She smiled more often. Her light gray eyes, clear and expressive, looked at the world with wonder and interest. He inherited her gaze. His eyes were the same shade. In the moment when he looked at her intently, she seemed to see her own reflection in the mirror. He resembled her, the same proud profile, narrow face, broad cheekbones, only significantly paler than hers. The massive, wide forehead was from his father, which until recently had been hidden under a lush hairstyle. Now his hair was cut short, and nothing distracted from his intelligent face. She was proud of her tall and handsome son, despite everything. "You just had to wait, to endure until the ceremony, then do as you wish. You mean to say that everything will end with the ceremony?" His voice carried sarcasm. "I thought that's where it all begins." Long fingers gripped the wooden armrests of the chair tightly. The man stood up sharply and approached the window. They stood side by side. It was now clear that they were almost the same height, but not because he was short, rather because she was incredibly tall. She turned and scrutinized her son's profile with a sharp gaze, barely restraining the desire to hug him, to tilt his head toward her, to melt the ice in his eyes with kisses, to make him laugh, to laugh as he used to, unrestrained and infectious. But the fear of stepping out of the role she had assumed long ago held back the impulse. She allowed herself only a slight hint of affection, barely touching his hand with her cold, thin fingers, lightly gripping the fabric of his sleeve. "Richard." A wary look met her face. There was a hint of surprise in it, understandably. His mother's voice carried a forgotten tenderness. For a moment, he felt that time had turned back, and before him was the old Lalia, whom he had gazed at with undisguised admiration and adoration, first from the cradle, then from a child's chair, and finally from a hard school bench. Everything around him changed. Himself, the setting, people, but the angle from which he always looked at his mother, upward, remained constant. This lasted until one moment, he became an adult. A second ago he was still a child, concerned with childish thoughts and tasks, and suddenly everything changed beyond recognition. And most importantly, she changed, terribly and irreparably. Even now, he sometimes felt like a puppy thrown into an icy pool. Deep inside, that silent adoration still lingered, trying to break through from within. At times, it seemed that a little more and it would tear him apart, an unquenchable thirst for love and attention. But icy restraint, a perfect jailer. No warmth, however strong, could escape its control. He slightly pulled away, and his mother's hand slid down his smooth sleeve without conveying the faintest hint of tenderness. You know, Mother, sometimes I feel like you see me as nothing more than a breeding bull, not a son." His cold mockery struck harder than a whip, leaving invisible, bloody marks. With an effort of will, the woman suppressed a cry of anger. The desire to slap him dissolved in her clenched fists. She hissed quietly in pain. A drop of blood appeared on her nail. She deserved this. But how much longer must she bear this penance? She was tired, deadly tired. Once having shown willpower, she couldn't follow through. What to regret now? The unsaid words at the right moment, the undone actions when needed. Watching her son's slender figure fall into a chair like a tree broken by a storm, she turned away and quickly headed for the exit. Now, with her face hidden in the twilight, it twisted into a grimace of suffering. And again, he was alone. This conversation, like a slight disturbance on the smooth surface of a lake, briefly touched his feelings, and then vanished as if it had never happened. A few seconds later, the image of the recent encounter faded from his memory, like an artist washing off an incorrect and clumsy sketch from the canvas. A sketch. That's what it was. This conversation had no meaning since it would have no consequences. Such conversations had happened every time for several years since this idea emerged. However, it was too early to reproach it for absurdity. Perhaps something would come of it. His mother had always succeeded in achieving what she wanted. "Do you judge me too, Hector?" From the shadowed wall, like a veil, a short figure emerged. The person approached the chair, and in the faint evening light, filtering through the high-pointed stained glass windows, a sturdy man with large hands and feet was revealed. He was no longer young. Silver streaked his short hair and bushy mustache. "No, my lord, I only regret another lost opportunity." His eyes, an unusual violet color among humans with vertical cat-like pupils, looked calm and slightly sad, though his lips smiled. "You know what troubles your mother." A faceless gray servant slipped in through the door, following a barely noticeable nod, placed a tray with a decanter and 2 goblets on the table, and disappeared as quickly as he had appeared, as if melting into the twilight. "Yes," sighed Richard heavily, accepting the goblet filled with a thick blood-red drink from his mentor. "Thank you. There's only one thing I can't understand. And if a boy is born—" Again. He glanced inquisitively at Hector standing beside him. "If it happens again, the history of my family has shown that a woman's wish also carries weight. What then, huh? Will they drown him, hang him, strangle him right in the womb, killing the unsuspecting mother along with him? Do you really want me to be part of that?" "What horrors come to your mind, my lord?" came the restrained response. "Your mother is not a monster, just like the rest." Richard, catching the unspoken thought, smirked. "You mean to say that despite everything they raised me? I think they already regret it. I caused too much trouble. And mother—" He bit his lip, as if catching a sharp remark ready to escape, and didn't continue. "Listen," he perked up, "let's go for a walk, to the west. Maybe the wind will clear the clouds and we'll make it by sunset. You know how it is this time of year." Something suddenly cheerful appeared in Richard's face, in his entire figure. He jumped up as if shaking off the gloom and cold weighing him down. A light flush appeared on his cheeks, and his eyes sparkled with anticipation of adventure. "Boy," thought Hector, and aloud he remarked, "It's quite a distance on 2 legs." "So, on 4, smiled Richard. The smile was such a rare guest on his protégé's face that Hector's heart involuntarily contracted with a strange, aching feeling. "Maybe we should think about cloaks," the mentor suggested. Mischief sparkled in his eyes like little golden fish. "Then let's go." The wolves ran side by side, paw to paw, nose to nose, glancing at each other and around. but without turning their heads, just slightly shifting their eyes to the side. By nature, they had an excellent sense of smell, and turning their heads was unnecessary. Casting a keen, steady gaze on the road ahead, they saw the white plain of the wide valley, covered with recently fallen snow. Their tracks were the first to decorate the natural canvas with a mysterious script, unfamiliar even to seasoned hunters. Though they were much heavier and larger than ordinary wolves, their prints were barely noticeable and were quickly covered by a light drift, veiling the cuneiform with a snowy shroud. "So you are a werewolf? Does that scare you?" "I didn't have time to be scared, and now I simply can't afford it. You saved my life, again. In fact, nothing very dangerous was threatening you, Aglaia. My transformation was more an instinctual response to danger in general, rather than something truly serious in this case." She stared at him intently, as if expecting a wolf's snout to emerge from behind his human face. "This explains a lot," she said thoughtfully, finally turning her attention to the plate in front of her. Richard exhaled carefully. Her gaze had burned across his face, and a sheen of sweat covered his forehead. An unbearable childlike desire to crawl under the table seized him. "What exactly?" he asked with effort. His voice was detached and indifferent, contrary to the anxiety washing over him. He didn't know how to act or what to say. In fact, he never did. When her gray, glass-clear eyes turned toward him, he would get flustered, struggling to gather his thoughts and find the right words. Her gaze seemed to place shackles on his mind, and at those moments, he felt slow-witted and dim. It wouldn't have been surprising if she thought the same. He had often tried to find confirmation of his expectations in her attitude toward him, in her words, but her behavior was always quite ordinary. Calm friendliness was present in her voice and demeanor. Aglaia was grateful for her rescue. That was natural. She showed her gratitude in what she thought he expected from her. Aglaia thoughtfully played with her food, as if she hadn't heard his question. Then she looked up and cautiously asked, "Would you be offended if I asked you a question? You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I would really like to know." She wrinkled her nose cutely and glanced at him slyly from under her eyebrows. In that moment she was unbearably charming. "What do you want to know?" He smiled, instantly forgetting the doubts and shyness that had plagued him just moments ago. "How old are you?" Richard choked and coughed in surprise, as he had least expected such a question after her cautious prelude. 40, he replied, when he could breathe freely again. "I apologize." Her thin, reddish eyebrows arched in surprise. "You look so young." "But that age can hardly be called old, can it?" Richard clarified cheerfully. He was finding this conversation increasingly amusing. For the first time since her arrival at the house, he wanted to talk, and talk honestly. "Of course," Aglaia blushed. "I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say, or rather not how I meant to ask. I understand. You see, werewolves have their advantages too." He experienced immense and incomparable pleasure observing her embarrassment. This embarrassment made her lower her eyes, allowing him to scrutinize her features shamelessly. "Many women would consider such advantages a great gift," she remarked coquettishly, glancing quickly at the table. What kind of gift? More like an inevitable burden. She opened her eyes wide in surprise, hearing the involuntary bitterness in his voice. Such words required an explanation. "You see, Aglaia, a werewolf's abilities are a kind of mutation. They have their positive and negative sides. For example, tell me." "Do you really need to know?" "Yes, but I think you want to tell me too." The last phrase slipped out unexpectedly, on its own accord. Aglaia blushed again. She couldn't understand what made her say those words, She wasn't well versed in psychology. Common sense should have kept her tongue in check and prevented her from angering the master of the house. After all, she still didn't know where this house was and how to get out of it. But she didn't really want to leave anymore. A mystery loomed on the horizon, and she loved all kinds of puzzles. And the master of the castle reminded her more of a medieval knight, with some incomprehensible codes, rather than a modern man. That, too, required understanding. Aglaia was a romantic girl, though she tried her best to hide it from herself and her acquaintances. She explained her passion for romance and Gothic literature simply as a curiosity. In reality, her head was filled with a jumble of notions, motives, desires, and aspirations, partly drawn from movies, partly snatched from books. Not always quality books, but she was satisfied with them. She saw that she was being scrutinized shamelessly, but for some reason couldn't respond with a bold look or an angry remark, anything that could stop this embarrassing examination. She sharply felt how the roles had changed. Now she was being studied. Aglaia realized with surprise that she even found this scrutiny somewhat pleasant. Just a little, just a bit. She straightened slightly, as if to sit more comfortably, unconsciously demonstrating the grace of her slender, flexible figure. Her hands gently placed the cutlery beside the empty plate, and then lowered smoothly onto her lap. Richard was surprised again. Perhaps she was right. He did want to tell her everything and see how she would react. All previous listeners had fled headlong. He was suddenly filled with a competitive interest. Could he tell his story in a way that would keep her, if not next to him, then at least in the castle? Only in her presence did he suddenly realize that the cook was quite good, and the aged wine had a much stronger effect than he had previously thought. All these surprising metamorphoses required understanding. You see, a werewolf is quite a rare type of mutation. More often there are manifestations of other obvious magical abilities. For example, I'm quite sure that you don't even suspect that besides me, Hector, and the servants you know and have met, my mother also lives in the castle. And some other people you know nothing about. It's as if they are not here. This is a manifestation of one of the magical abilities, concealment, or the ability to become invisible. Not that they dissolve into thin air? No. Simply put, if my mother wishes, you could walk beside her all day and never know that you are being watched. You wouldn't hear, feel, or bump into anything that would allow you to discover her. It's a very convenient trait, in demand in certain professions. There are magical abilities that allow you to feel plants, control fire or water, and many others. Our mages have a wide variety of skills. Werewolves look rather poor by comparison. I can't create fire with a wave of my hand. I can't move objects with my mind. I can't develop enormous speed. And although as a wolf I am stronger and more enduring than many, I have more limitations than all the others. How so? First of all, animals and humans have different lifespans. Transforming into a human doesn't stop the wolf's life cycle. It just slows it down. Some of the wolf's abilities remain when I am a human, like reaction speed or strength. What I mean is, when I am human, I am still a bit of a wolf too. There is always a chance that transforming into a wolf, I won't be able to turn back, because my wolf's life will end. I will simply die, and that's all. In families where there are werewolves, this scares the relatives the most. Neither you nor those around you know when this will happen. Of course, it is partially possible to track this. You suddenly realize that in the wolf form it takes more effort to do things that used to be easy. But there are always other explanations for this, and few remember everything that happened to them in wolf form. Only separate moments, and even then, vaguely. To retain memory or part of consciousness during transformation usually requires long and persistent training. It's best if these are conducted under the guidance of an experienced person, possibly someone who has already subdued their changing nature, or someone who has studied werewolves extensively. But I must tell you that no amount of study from the outside will describe everything as it truly is. It won't tell the whole truth. Moreover, the animal essence has its demands when you are in a wolf's skin. He smirked. For example, it is hard to resist the call of blood. In my case, a wolf is a predator. Chasing prey is its life. I can control the wolf to a certain point, but if it senses prey, its fear, and blood, control becomes problematic. Are there different kinds of animals among you? Mostly predators, and their lifespan is not long. Could you kill someone? A loved one? He looked at her strangely from under his brows and bent lower over his plate. I said problematic, not impossible, came his muffled response. In that moment, Richard suddenly felt tired. The recent willingness to talk openly vanished, replaced by a mixture of amazement and hatred. He couldn't understand what had caused such a desire in him. A man who generally disliked talking about himself, let alone explaining anything to someone else. A stranger. He looked at the woman sitting opposite with dislike and couldn't comprehend his recent sympathy. Now everything about her seemed too bright, blinding his tired eyes. The white skin of her face and hands, which had once shone like the moon, now had a ghostly, lifeless gleam and repelled rather than attracted. She had undergone a crushing metamorphosis. He had never seen anything like it. A simple and honest thought was trying to break through at the back of his mind, but he wouldn't let it. The thought was that none of his previous interlocutors had ever said such a phrase. They had practically said nothing at all because they ran away earlier, out of fear and hatred. They were afraid he would attack them right then and there, sinking his teeth into their soft, pliable human throats. Too many scary rumors circulated about werewolves. No one sorted out which of these rumors were true and which were fiction. He was the only one who dared to do so, and only because he had no choice. He tried to pull himself together, realizing that perhaps the changes had not happened to her, but something had happened to him at that very moment. He stared at his hands as if expecting to see wolf paws instead, and at the same moment felt the wave of transformation coming over him. His breathing quickened, his forehead broke out in sweat. His frightened mind began to race, silently calling for help, and help came. He heard the voice that could always calm him. "Richard, are you all right?" Attentive violet eyes looked at him kindly and insistently, and a mental message penetrated his consciousness. Hector was sharing his strength to help him regain control. After a few moments, his breathing steadied, and Richard gratefully shook the hand holding his wrist. "Yes, Hector, I'm fine, thank you." He stood up carefully, slowly and lazily folding the napkin and dropping it onto the table. "It seems we will have to postpone our conversation for another time." Aglaya, he managed to say her name with difficulty. It was like a needle piercing his heart when he heard it from his own lips. "I apologize," he said politely, slightly bowing his head, though he wanted nothing less than to be gallant. He turned slowly and, accompanied by Hector, exited through the door. And there, just as the heavy doors closed behind him, it hit him. A picture so vivid and real appeared before his eyes that he involuntarily reached out to touch it. His nostrils flared, sensing the approaching wave of scent. His consciousness convulsed and faded. A step, another. How painful it was to walk. It would be so much easier to get on all fours and break free from this circle. But a soft, insistent voice cut through the tangle of ancient instincts. It tore them to shreds. Along with them, his veins burst and blood fell to the floor in large drops. Blood. Drops. His nostrils flared, catching the scent. His body was tearing into thousands of pieces. His veins throbbed and burst, and blood covered everything around. Those few yards to his bedroom felt like 2 or 3 hours, as he fought with all his might against the transformation that was crushing, twisting, and mangling him. But the quiet, confident, and reassuring voice he clung to led him forward. A step, another. He struggled through the instincts demanding his submission. He did not want to submit, not now. The viscous sludge wrapped around his legs, preventing movement. It sucked him in, stifling his breath. Finally, he made it. He collapsed. His lips touched something hard, his teeth clattered against the edge of the bowl, spilling its contents, and his white shirt turned red. Blood. He ground his teeth in rage, pushing away the unknown something that was supposed to help but didn't. He jerked and fell back, hitting his head. Wild pain splashed across his face in circles with scarlet streaks, and darkness fell. Darkness and peace. How is he? Hector turned sharply from the door, hearing an unusually high, almost squeaky voice. My lady, he bowed his head, showing respect to the mistress of the house. How is he? She finally managed to control her voice, suppressing sobs, burying them deep inside where no one would see. But her traitorous voice almost gave her away. All the agony she endured listening to the wild screams coming from behind the thick door. Behind the door, the terrible torment of transformation tore at her son's body. And he resisted. He's fine now. He's sleeping. Hector approached. A beam of the setting sun penetrated through the slightly open curtains and illuminated the wet path on his cheek. He made it, my lady. For a moment, Lilia lost control. Her legs gave way and she slid down the wall. He's sleeping, she repeated, as if tasting the words. She rolled each letter on her tongue and swallowed it along with her composure. Lilia ran her thin, long fingers through her high hairstyle and jerked her head violently. After standing for a moment, Hector carefully sat down next to her, leaning against the cold stone wall, not feeling the chill. Rifia was a dear child. She started walking before she could talk, so she didn't communicate her desires with cries or the usual baby cooing. She simply went where she wanted, exploring every interesting place, often sending her caretakers into a frenzy searching for her. She loved everyone, but most of all her brother. He was 10 years older and likely seemed almost omnipotent to her. For a long time, he was burdened by her constant presence as she interfered with his serious affairs, clinging to his clothes and following him everywhere. No matter how hard he tried to get rid of her, it never worked. At first, his playmates laughed at him. Then they got used to it. When they asked where his tail was, he felt mocked, and everything inside him bristled with resentment toward the silly little girl who constantly exposed him to the barbs of cruel words. Gradually, his friends understood what made him wince, why his gaze filled with a chilling darkness, and later with uncontrolled and menacing hatred. The harmless jabs, which were not inherently offensive, ceased, but he did not forget them. He found in them justification for his failures, which happened to him as they did to any boy his age. These were failures in understanding his body's capabilities, his strength. All things learned through hundreds of repetitions and training, but he wanted it all at once. And he believed that his hatred, brought to light by the mockery, hindered him from achieving everything immediately. From such thoughts, it was a short step to realizing who was the cause of this mockery. Rifia. He tried to avoid her, but the girl found him everywhere, seemingly appearing at the most inopportune moments. His mother added fuel to the fire by behaving strangely, as if trying to protect the girl from her brother. Yet he had never even touched her, not even once. He hadn't even flicked her nose. "He hates me," she said in a muffled voice. Hector, distracted from his thoughts, looked at the clear profile of the woman sitting next to him. She was beautiful. Age and hardships had left their marks, but not prominently. Like light wrinkles around the eyes and sorrowful lines at the corners of her mouth, visible through a translucent veil. The expression of weariness made them more pronounced. Her eyes, steel gray and cold, seemed softened by the veil of tears, making them appear warmer. Did she have to suffer and cry now to reveal the best qualities that once made her future husband lose his head? "Lalia," he allowed himself to call her by name. Half turning, he gently covered her hand, lying limply on the floor with his large, strong fingers. A son cannot hate his mother. She glanced sideways, a smirk touching her lips. Unless the mother has done something to be hated for. Her voice suddenly rang with steel, as if she was about to cut open her chest with words. She resolutely pulled her hand out of his warm fingers, stood up. Straightening her dress, she headed for the stairs, away from the room where she had spent several bitter hours, trembling and listening to the sounds coming from behind the door. She stopped abruptly, hearing a soft call, but did not turn around. "Lalia." Hector looked at the departing woman's back. He couldn't let her leave like this, without trying to offer some comfort. Understanding that the main comfort must come from mother and son. "Lalia, I don't know anything your son could hate you for. Nothing he couldn't understand and forgive. You need to share your pain and fears with him. Richard is your son. He loves you, despite everything." She listened. Her shoulders drooped. The simple home dress rustled faintly with each step. Hector watched the departing woman, and his heart ached for both of them.
Story 3.
In the dead silence of the dark room, where light barely filtered through the dusty shelves, I cautiously made my way between them. My heart pounded wildly, responding to every rustle in this grim labyrinth. She was here in the shadows, an elusive presence hunting me. Her footsteps were heavy and uneven, and I could feel the chill and terror in the air. I tried to move quietly, but the sound of my steps seemed loud in this eerie silence. I stopped, hearing a rustle very close by. In the darkness, behind one of the shelves, I saw a distorted silhouette. For a moment our eyes met, and in hers I caught a glimpse of something familiar, evoking an instant wave of pain and pity. I delved into my thoughts, trying to reconstruct the chain of events that led me to these unfortunate circumstances. And then, the pivotal moment resurfaced in my memory, the beginning of it all. It was a call from John that set off a series of incredible and tragic events. It was a sunny Sunday morning. I stood in the supermarket parking lot, waiting for my friend John. The parking lot was empty, as all normal people were still asleep at this early hour. Forcing someone to get up so early on a weekend was a form of sadism that my friend possessed in full. Just a few days ago, he had called me while I was repairing another laptop at the computer repair shop where I worked. "Hey, David," he said. "I've got good news for you. This Sunday we're going camping out of town." "No thanks," I automatically declined. I knew you'd say that, but I have one argument that'll make you agree. Guess who else is coming with us?" "And who might that be?" I grumbled. "Emily, my boring friend, that very Emily. She'll be bringing a friend along. So, do you still not want to go?" Damn, John hit a sore spot. He knew I had been crushing on her for a long time. So here I was, getting up early, taking a shower, and carefully combing my hair, standing in the parking lot, waiting for the girl of my dreams. Soon, I saw my friend's pickup truck driving down the empty highway. It was painted a deep black, with fiery waves of red-orange shades on the sides, creating the illusion of flames engulfing the vehicle. On the hood was an imposing, aggressive-looking vinyl decal of a skull surrounded by electric guitars and lightning bolts. I think this truck fully reflected my friend's character, a reckless guitarist in a heavy metal band. I recalled an incident that had happened to him recently. Every year, our town hosted a music festival, held outdoors, attracting many rock music fans. John, unable to resist impressing the crowd, decided to use his pickup as part of his performance. Armed with an electric guitar, he drove straight onto the stage in his pickup, as lightning and flames flashed on the screens, created by special effects. Stopping right in front of the crowd, he turned his audio system up to full volume, turning the pickup into an impromptu stage. Then, standing on the roof of his pickup, John began to play a guitar solo, synchronizing his performance with the deafening riffs blaring from his car speakers. At that moment, the stage was lit up with bright spotlights, and artificial smoke began to pour from special machines, adding to the dramatic effect. John played like a man possessed, stunning everyone with his passion and skill. At the end of his performance, he pulled off an incredible stunt, jumping from the roof of the pickup straight onto the stage, never stopping his guitar playing. People talked about this event for a long time. John was always the life of the party, a person whose cheerfulness and boundless energy drew people to him. But someone once said his thirst for adventure would eventually end in trouble. I agreed with that, but there was nothing I could do about it, as he was my only friend. When the pickup stopped next to me, out came a medium-height guy with long, curly hair, a confident smile on his face, and eyes gleaming with excitement and enthusiasm. He was wearing a black t-shirt with a skull and worn jeans. This was John. He walked up to me, slapped me on the shoulder, and asked how I was feeling. I replied that everything was okay, but my gaze was fixed on the car's interior, from the back door of which two girls were emerging. The first was Emily. She was short, with long, soft chestnut hair tied in a loose bun. Her bright blue eyes attracted attention with their simplicity and sincerity. Following her was her friend Sophia, a tall girl with long black hair, dressed all in black, emanating a gloomy atmosphere and looking somewhat detached. When Emily approached us, she responded to my greeting with a sweet and slightly embarrassed smile, while her friend merely nodded in acknowledgement. We hadn't even started talking when a gray Prius quietly pulled into the parking lot, and out came a somewhat plump guy wearing large, thick glasses. I knew him. It was Patrick, but everyone called him the professor because he always studied hard and loved to share his knowledge, even when not asked. From the passenger seat emerged someone I wanted to see the least. It was a blond guy with neatly combed hair, blue eyes, and a confident smile. Many called him handsome, but only I knew how rotten this playboy's core was. His name was Tyler. I never liked him, and everyone knew it, especially John. I shot John an angry look, to which he quietly whispered in my ear, "Sorry, man, when I invited Emily, this guy was hanging around and started inviting himself. I couldn't refuse." I elbowed John in the side. What annoyed me most about Tyler was that he constantly hit on Emily. She politely brushed him off, but he didn't stop trying. Apparently, he decided not to miss his chance this time either. As we gathered in a circle, an awkward pause ensued, which John, of course, broke. "So, folks, we're going to a place my uncle's friend told me about. The views are amazing. There's a river nearby. We'll set up camp and have a blast." We nodded without much enthusiasm. Before leaving, we went into the supermarket and stocked up on food and drinks. In the outdoor section, I noticed bear spray. Taking it in my hands and examining it, I heard a snort behind me. It was Tyler. "What? Scared of bears?" he asked mockingly and laughed as he walked away. "Jerk," I thought to myself, and still put the spray in the basket. Soon we loaded everything into the pickup's bed and set off. I sat in the passenger seat next to John, fortunately with the girls in the back, and a disgruntled Tyler, who had tried to ride with us, following in the Prius. Soon we left the city. The destination was about 50 miles away. The journey was pleasant, the road taking us farther away from urban life, with the surroundings becoming increasingly wild and untouched with each mile. Upon arriving, we found the perfect spot for our camp. It was on a small elevation, offering a view of a wide, calmly flowing river. The river's water was clear and cool, sparkling under the evening sun. Dense forests stretched along both sides of the river, creating a sense of seclusion and peace. We decided to set up camp on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. There was enough space for our tents and a campfire. The forest made quiet sounds, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds, and the distant noise of the river. The air was fresh and filled with the scents of pine and earth. After pitching our tents, we gathered firewood. It was already around noon, so we decided to have lunch. Setting up the grill, we roasted some meat. Soon, a pleasant aroma spread throughout the area. Satisfied and content, John burped and patted his belly, earning a reproachful "John" from Emily, and then decided to break the silence. "You know, guys, this place is great, but my uncle told me about another spot nearby. Should we take a walk and check it out?" The real reason we were gathered here, I thought. In my experience, John's ideas never ended well, but I noticed curiosity and approval on the others' faces, especially Emily's. Everyone began agreeing, and not wanting to be seen as a coward, I also agreed. Everyone started getting ready to head out. Just in case, I took a backpack, where I put a compass, flashlight, water, and that bear spray. John also had a bag, with a large box inside, judging by its shape. This made me wary. What was he planning? Soon we set off. The forest was dense and impenetrable, full of the whispers of leaves and mysterious sounds of nature. Following a narrow path, we made our way through the thick undergrowth, where each step was noticeably harder than the last. The light filtering through the dense canopy created a dappled pattern of light and shadow on the ground. From time to time, we stopped to breathe in the fresh, forest-scented air and listen to the sounds surrounding us. Distant bird songs, the rustling of small creatures hiding in the bushes, and the mysterious noise of the wind among the branches. As we progressed, the forest grew thicker, and the path became barely visible. In some places, we had to push through thickets. After a long journey through the forest, we finally emerged into a spacious clearing. Unexpectedly, we found ourselves in front of an old wooden house hidden among the trees. It seemed surprisingly well maintained despite its age. The house was built of dark wood, its roof covered with moss, and the windows adorned with carved shutters. We cautiously approached the house, scrutinizing its details. The wooden planks of the walls were expertly joined, and on the porch stood old but neatly arranged chairs and a small table. Everything around was quiet, with only a light breeze rustling the leaves. As we began to examine the house, an elderly man suddenly emerged from it. His thick beard was silver gray, and his gaze was wise and penetrating. He was dressed simply, in an old-fashioned shirt and worn trousers. His appearance startled us a bit, especially the girls who hid behind our backs, with Emily, to my delight, hiding behind me. The man stopped on the porch, looked at us intently, and said, "You seem lost. Don't be afraid. I've lived here for a long time and helped many lost tourists. You just need to turn south now, and you'll see a path. Follow it, and you'll reach the road." John intervened. "No, sir. We're not lost, just wandering. We saw the house along the way and were curious. Sorry to bother you. Goodbye." And he turned and headed north, and we uncertainly followed him. The man, seeing where we were going, shouted after us, "Wait, don't go that way. It can be dangerous." "Don't worry, sir. We're just taking a walk and we'll return soon," John replied without looking back and continued on his way. The professor caught up with him and whispered, "Maybe we should listen to this man. He wouldn't warn us for nothing." "Don't be afraid. My uncle's friend has been there 1,000 times, and even if it's dangerous, it's so cool to find out what's going on there." John responded with his eyes shining. My companions began to glance at each other fearfully. "You've all fallen into my friend's trap, who is always looking for trouble," I thought. I even started to feel guilty for not warning the others that this walk could be dangerous since John was the initiator. Soon we disappeared behind the bushes, the man standing with his mouth open and his hand raised. Then he waved it and muttered something like, "I warned them." We continued our way, John trying to lighten the mood, constantly joking and laughing loudly, talking to the girls. I walked behind, envying how easily he could talk to people. I wanted to talk to Emily, but didn't know where to start. My chance came a little later when I saw that she had lagged behind, looking for something on the ground. I approached and asked what she had lost. "A bracelet. I recently knitted it," she replied. Like a knight, I threw myself into the search and soon found it. It was a beautiful knitted bracelet made of threads, indicating that the maker had considerable knitting talent. My joy knew no bounds, especially when she smiled at me with her bright smile. "Thank you," she said. "My grandmother taught me to knit. It's a kind of reminder of her." "You're welcome. By the way, you're really good at it." "Maybe you could knit me one as a thank you?" I asked cheekily. She smiled and was about to respond when suddenly something moved in the bushes. It was something huge and hairy. It was hard to see and say anything definite about it. Emily got scared and hid behind me. I guessed it might be a bear and reached into my bag for the spray. But suddenly everything went quiet. Sophia and Tyler ran up to us, asking what we were doing and eyeing us suspiciously. Emily began to explain, saying she had lost her bracelet, and I had helped her when we saw something like a bear in the bushes. "A bear?" John asked, surprised as he approached. "There are no bears in this forest. Maybe it was a boar." "Maybe," I replied uncertainly. But it seemed too big for a boar. John walked into the bushes where we had seen the creature, then looked around. Finding nothing, he called us to follow him since we were almost at our destination. Soon John stopped and looked around. Giant pine trees grew all around, completely blocking out the sunlight, creating a dim twilight. He then bent down, searching for something on the ground, and soon a victorious shout echoed. He called us over and showed us what he had found. It was an iron hatch. The surrounding ground was covered with moss and fallen leaves, making it almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. The hatch looked old and rusty, made of heavy metal. It was square-shaped with a recessed handle for opening. There were no inscriptions or markings on it, only the traces of time and corrosion. John tried to open it, but it was locked. Then John took off his backpack and pulled out a drill box labeled 850 watts and boasting that it could drill through any metal. Taking out the drill, he saw our surprised faces and explained that his uncle's friend had found this hatch recently and told John about it. Then, determining roughly where the lock was, he began drilling. There was nothing for us to do but sit nearby and wait for him to finish. After about 20 minutes of drilling and constant tugging at the handle, the hatch finally gave way and opened. We crowded around the hole and peered inside. The hatch descended deep into impenetrable darkness. You could climb down using a vertical ladder made of rebar. We looked at each other, waiting for someone to volunteer to go first. Then everyone looked at John since it was his idea, but suddenly Tyler volunteered. Apparently, he wanted to show off in front of the girls. Making a serious, heroic face, he took a flashlight and began to descend. We watched him. After a while, he disappeared into the darkness. We waited to see what would happen. About 5 minutes passed, but there was no word from Tyler. Then John leaned over and shouted into the hatch at the top of his lungs, "Tyler!" Suddenly, a beam of light hit him straight in the face, suggesting that electricity was still working down there, much to our surprise. Then we heard Tyler's voice, shouting for us to come down. John was the first to start descending, followed by the others. I brought up the rear. Honestly, I didn't really want to go down there. I looked around. It seemed like no one was around, but as my head was almost submerged in the hole, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped sharply and began to peer in the direction of the bushes, but saw nothing. A bad feeling lingered. Sighing wearily, I continued my descent. The shaft was about 30 feet deep, which seemed quite deep to me. Finally, I jumped onto the level floor and looked around. We found ourselves in a long, narrow corridor. The walls, covered in pale gray tiles, had held up fairly well, though there were chips and discolorations here and there. Weak but working neon lights flickered on the ceiling, creating a grim but sufficient illumination for inspection. The floor was covered in linoleum, which had peeled and curled in places, exposing the old concrete beneath. On both sides of the corridor were heavy metal doors with numbers and markings, many of which were already rusted and dusty. Some doors were ajar, leading to rooms that once served as laboratories or experiment chambers. The glass in some doors was broken, revealing dark, abandoned rooms. Along the length of the corridor ran pipes and wires, some of them sagging or detached from the walls, testifying to the long-gone days of activity. The air was filled with the smell of mold and old electronics, and the silence was broken only by our footsteps and a distant hum coming from the unknown depths of the laboratory. Everyone stood, curiously looking around. It was astonishing that this place still had functioning elements. I saw Tyler standing proudly near an electrical panel. The professor, especially excited, always loved places like this. He entered one of the rooms, then peeked out and beckoned us over. When we entered, we saw an old laboratory. The walls of the room were lined with old, peeling white tiles showing signs of age and long-dried stains of unknown substances. In the center stood a long work table covered in a layer of dust. Scattered across the table were various lab tools. Test tubes, flasks, pipettes, all coated with a thick layer of dust and forgotten for many years. In the corner of the room was a cabinet filled with numerous glass jars, many of which were still sealed, containing unknown chemical compounds, colored solutions, and powders. Some jars were broken and their contents had dried up, leaving colorful traces on the shelves. An old microscope, covered in dust, stood on one side of the table, as if forgotten in the middle of an important experiment. Next to it lay notes and records on sheets of paper, their ink faded, making the text barely readable. Spreading out around the room, we began examining everything. The air was filled with sighs and exclamations of amazement, especially from the professor, who nervously moved from one corner of the room to another, excited by the discovery. Meanwhile, I noticed John carefully placing several tools into his bag. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass and a frightened scream echoed. I quickly turned and saw Emily with a cut finger, which was stained green from the liquid in the broken test tube, whose shards lay on the floor. Rushing to her, I pulled out a water bottle and a bandage to immediately clean the wound and prevent infection. After all, no one knew what was in that tube. Carefully treating and bandaging the wound, I breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that the injury was not serious. Emily smiled gratefully at me, and I felt incredible happiness from being able to help. Seeing that everything was okay, John warned everyone to be more careful. We continued exploring. Exiting into the corridor, we began to peek into each room one by one, but there was nothing of interest until we heard a loud, frightened scream. We turned and saw Sophia running out of a room we had not yet checked. Her face was scared, and she was trembling all over. We asked what was in there, but she didn't answer immediately, instead pointing a shaking finger at the door. "There's something horrible in there. I can't," she stammered. "You have to see it for yourselves." We decided to check it out and cautiously entered the room. When we saw what was inside, we gasped in fear. Everyone reacted differently. John whistled. Tyler jumped back in fright. The professor tremblingly fell to the floor, and Emily screamed and covered her mouth with her hands. I simply stood, dumbstruck and mesmerized by what lay before us. In front of us stood a huge capsule about 10 feet in diameter, filled with a shimmering green liquid. Inside, suspended in this mysterious substance, floated an enormous head resembling that of a wolf, but many times larger and with distinct differences from a regular animal. This head looked more like a monster from a fantasy story, with sharp fangs and grotesque, unnatural features. To grasp its size, imagine an adult man spreading his arms wide but still unable to encompass it completely. Around the capsule were numerous wires connected to various devices and screens that blinked and displayed various data and graphs. These screens seemed to monitor the condition or some parameters of the capsule and its contents. The room was dimly lit by the monitors and the soft glow of the liquid in the capsule, creating a gloomy and mysterious atmosphere. We stood, stunned by this sight, trying to understand what kind of experiment this was and what its purpose could be. Once we came to our senses, we began to look around. John pulled out his phone and started filming. We moved closer and looked at the head inside. Up close, it seemed even more realistic and terrifying. Have you ever been to a zoo and seen a tiger? It seems like a regular big cat on TV, but when you stand next to it, you realize it's a truly massive beast. Here was an enormous head, so how big was the body? Was this a monster the size of a dinosaur? Could it be a dummy? Possibly, but the head looked too realistic. Thoughts like these swirled in our minds. Talking or making noise in this atmosphere was frightening. It seemed that if we did something wrong, this creature would awaken. We stood a while longer, studying everything around, and then decided to leave. As I was leaving the room, I swear I thought the creature's eye moved in our direction. I caught the slightest movement of the pupil. Frightened, I recoiled and quickly decided to exit the room. The others looked at me in surprise, but I just shrugged, saying nothing because I didn't want to be seen as a coward. I could see that everyone was starting to get nervous and there were already suggestions to return, but John insisted on exploring a few more rooms. Reluctantly, everyone agreed. Moving further down the corridor, we discovered an evacuation plan and realized that this laboratory was huge. We had only explored a small part of it. The professor pointed to a room labeled Archive. We decided to go there. Soon we found the right door and entered. The room was spacious, with high ceilings and shelves filled with old books, documents, and boxes. The shelves held stacks of dusty folders, tapes, and old reels. The air in the archive was heavy with the smell of old paper and metal. In one corner of the archive stood a video viewing device, an old film projector which seemed like it might still work. Next to it was a table with several film reels on it. These reels were neatly labeled, and we realized that they might contain valuable information about the lab's past research. Examining the reels, we chose the one labeled General Analysis and Conclusions. Preparing the projector, we inserted this reel. Once the device was turned on, the archive wall turned into a screen, showing frames from an old film. The image was black and white, a bit shaky but clear enough to make out the details. We held our breath in anticipation of learning the secrets hidden in these old records. The screen showed a man in a white lab coat standing next to a huge capsule. He seemed vaguely familiar to me. To date, it has been 65 days since the start of our research, he began his report. We have discovered that the head in the capsule is alive but does not respond to external stimuli. However, our experiments with its blood have shown astonishing results. On the screen, the scientist paused, sighed, and continued. This blood contains a virus that interacts with human DNA, causing genetic changes that lead to physical transformation. We discovered this, unfortunately, due to a tragic accident. One of our scientists had direct contact with the blood of this creature. After 2 hours, the transformation occurred, and the victim turned into a wolf-like anthropomorphic creature and began attacking everyone around. We barely managed to neutralize this being and then began studying how to combat this virus. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered and the video skipped ahead. We have developed an antidote, the scientist continued, holding a vial labeled HN13. It must be administered within the first 2 hours after infection to prevent the transformation. The first signs of infection include a sharp increase in body temperature, changes in eye color, accelerated hair and nail growth, as well as increased physical strength and aggression. We sat in front of the screen, listening intently to what the scientist was saying. Emily was sitting to my right. I looked at her, and she noticed, looking back at me with her warm smile. My heart froze in fear. Her eyes, which had always been so clear and kind, had suddenly changed. They had become bright yellow gold, reminiscent of a predator's eyes, reflecting light in a way that left me speechless for a moment. In that first second, I couldn't even believe what I was seeing. I remembered the scientist's words about the change in eye color. Emily saw my reaction and got scared too, asking, "What's wrong? Is there something on me?" Your eyes," I said with difficulty, feeling a heavy burden from the bad news. Everyone turned, hearing our conversation, and Sophia covered her mouth in horror. Tyler ran up to Emily, grabbed her shoulders, and looked into her eyes. Then he fearfully took a few steps back. Emily pulled a small mirror from her bag and brought it to her face with a trembling hand, staring at her eyes for a long time before tears streamed down her cheeks. It seemed the test tube she had cut herself on contained the creature's blood. We all sat in stunned silence, not knowing what to do. I approached her and hugged her. She buried her face in my shoulder and sobbed loudly. My chest ached, and I replayed the scientist's words in my mind, remembering that he mentioned an antidote. I gently pulled away from Emily and approached the projector. Rewinding the reel back, I paused the image on the moment where the scientist held the vial. I pointed to it. "We need to find this within an hour and a half, since it's been half an hour since the infection. The vial labeled HN13. We'll split up. Each of us will take a wing of the building." A spark of hope ignited in me and spread to the others. Even Tyler nodded in agreement. We divided the areas among the 5 of us, leaving Emily to sit in the archive. I set a timer on my watch and ran with all my strength. Every second was crucial. Soon I reached door number 37, labeled Experimental Laboratory. I yanked the door open and burst into the room. It was shrouded in a gloomy atmosphere filled with shadows and cold. Surrounding me were rows of capsules, each containing dead chimeras immersed in green liquid. These motionless creations, a chaotic mix of different animal parts, were a haunting reminder of the horrific experiments conducted here many years ago. The air reeked of decay and chemicals, making my throat clench with revulsion. I had no time to study my surroundings. My head swiveled in search of the antidote, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, I noticed a dark figure gliding in the shadows. I quickly hid behind a nearby table, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. When I dared to peek out, a horrifying creature lunged at me. Its eyes burned with yellow fire, and its sinister fangs glinted in the flickering light. Its fur was dark and thick, and its muscles twitched with rage and power. Instinctively, I jumped back. The beast lunged again, smashing capsules and splattering green liquid everywhere. Glass shards flew, and the grotesque creatures fell to the floor with a wet thud. I thought it was the end, but at the last moment I remembered the bear spray in my bag. Grabbing it, I quickly turned and sprayed the beast right in the face. The spray worked. The werewolf howled in pain and fury, knocking the spray from my hands and breaking it. Clutching its mangled face, it fled into the dark corridor. What was that? I stood in shock, surrounded by the wreckage of the laboratory. Breathing heavily as if after a sprint, I tried to calm down and collect my thoughts. Could there be other infected creatures here? I needed to warn the others. But first, I thoroughly searched every corner, finding no antidote. I ran into the corridor, but it was empty. I remembered everyone had scattered throughout the building, and finding them now would be problematic. I checked my watch. Time was running out. Hoping the others were okay, I ran, checking each room along the way. Finding nothing, I started to wonder what to do next. Standing in the middle of the corridor, I suddenly heard a terrifying scream of pain. I ran towards it and saw that the others had also gathered: Sophia, Tyler, and John. It felt like a plunge into icy water. Professor was missing, and it was likely his scream we had heard. My companions exchanged frightened looks. John asked, "What's going on?" I didn't explain, but ran into the room from which the scream had come. It was a large room filled with archive documents neatly placed on shelves that resembled library sections. Shelves stretched along the walls and throughout the space, creating narrow passageways between them. The air was filled with the faint smell of old paper and dust, and the dim light from rare lamps gave the room a gloomy and mysterious atmosphere. We cautiously made our way between the rows of shelves, looking for signs of the professor. However, what we found was worse than anything we could have imagined. Behind one of the rows, in an alcove between the shelves, we saw my friend's body. It was brutally mutilated, as if attacked by a monster. Pages and documents were scattered around, creating chaos and disorder. The floor was smeared with blood that had not yet fully dried, and the air was thick with the sharp metallic smell. This discovery froze us in horror and grief. Sophia was trembling with fear, her face pale. Tyler squatted, trying to comprehend what had happened, and John stood in the corner, nervously fidgeting with his flashlight. Perhaps he blamed himself for bringing us here. I sighed and recounted what had happened earlier. They listened, terrified. Sophia turned and said we should run and call for help. I thought it was a wise decision, but then we wouldn't be able to save Emily. It was selfish, but I could only think of her. Tyler volunteered to go with Sophia while John and I decided to stay and continue the search. Suddenly, a menacing growl echoed. We quickly turned around, realizing the danger was near. Sophia panicked and ran for the exit. We followed her, finding the corridor empty. Sophia hurried toward the hatch through which we had entered, with Tyler following. John and I stood there, pondering where the antidote might be. Suddenly, we heard a noise and simultaneously looked up. Something was crawling along the ceiling, or rather inside the ventilation system. John and I exchanged glances and understood how this creature moved. To our horror, we realized it was headed where Sophia and Tyler had gone. We ran after them. I checked my watch. Only half an hour left. A knot tightened in my chest. Would we make it in time to save Emily? The creature moved quickly, and soon the noise in the ventilation system quieted ahead. We ran as fast as we could, rounding corners and trying to speed up. When we were almost at the hatch, we saw at the end of the long corridor the werewolf jumping on Tyler, who fought with all his might to fend it off. To our horror, we saw Sophia's body lying near the struggle. John ran faster and kicked the creature, sending it flying against the wall. It hit the wall and collapsed to the side. Growling heavily, the werewolf slowly began to rise on its hind legs. I ran to Tyler and helped him up. We stood facing each other, waiting for the first move. The werewolf was breathing heavily, its chest rising and falling, green liquid dripping from its mouth. We noticed it was crouching, preparing to jump. Suddenly we heard a noise, as if someone had fallen from a height onto a marble floor, followed by gunshots. The werewolf was shot midair and, spraying green blood, fell right in front of us. Twitching in convulsions, it let out a pitiful moan and died. In shock, we turned around. Standing near the exit staircase was the elderly man we had met at the house in the forest. In his hands was a large double-barreled shotgun, smoke rising from its barrels. He approached the creature, bent down to ensure it was dead, then rose and walked over to Sophia, checking her pulse. Sighing regretfully, he told us she was gone. We stood in sorrow, looking at her body. The man pulled us from our thoughts. We need to leave quickly. It's not safe here. I was about to thank him for saving us and tell him about Emily, but when I looked closely at his face, I remembered where I had seen him. It was not for nothing that I thought the professor in the video looked familiar. It was our savior. I ran to him and grabbed his sleeve. "Sir, it's urgent. Where can we find the antidote? Our friend is infected. You have to help us." He gently pushed me away, then sighed heavily, slinging his gun over his shoulder, and said wearily, "There is no antidote. The last doses were destroyed, and the scientist who developed it lies before you." We looked at the werewolf's corpse in confusion, and the man continued, "It happened 30 years ago during a catastrophe here." "What do you mean there's no antidote?" I cried desperately. Then I checked my watch, only 15 minutes left. I turned and ran back to the archive where Emily should still be waiting for us. Behind me, I heard the man shouting, trying to stop me, but I kept running. They had no choice but to follow. Soon we arrived at the location, and I burst into the room, but to my horror found no one. Desperately, I called Emily's name, but there was no response. I was about to run out to search for her, but the man grabbed me firmly, preventing me from escaping. I looked at him angrily, but he said, "Calm down. I need to explain. It's too late to do anything. Going after her will only put you at risk." I tried to break free from his grip, but John and Tyler came over and placed their hands on my shoulders. I was angry and wanted to hit them for being traitors, but John quietly said, "Calm down, my friend. Let's hear what he has to say." I reluctantly nodded, and they loosened their grip. The man released me, stood in front of us, and began his story. "First, let me introduce myself. My name is Alexander Weiss. I used to work as a geneticist at the local university. We studied the genetic basis of diseases and everything related to it, uncovering complex connections between heredity and health." He placed his rifle on the table and began pacing the room, recalling the past. One day, a man approached me. As far as I knew, he was very wealthy and influential. Before telling me what he wanted, I was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I immediately understood the seriousness of the matter. A car was sent for me, and we drove to the mountains nearby, where there was an abandoned mine. The place was cordoned off, with armed guards all around. They searched me and took me inside. After descending quite deeply, we found ourselves at an entrance formed by a collapsed wall, leading into a massive cave. When I entered the cave, a breathtaking sight unfolded before me. It resembled an ancient temple. The walls were adorned with mysterious symbols and drawings depicting animals, astronomical signs, and incomprehensible writings. The air was filled with a sense that each symbol carried a part of a long-forgotten history. In the center of the cave, on what looked like a stone altar, lay a gigantic wolf's head. Its powerful fangs and dark fur with unusual markings evoked a mix of fear and admiration. The head's eyes were closed as if this creature were frozen in time, like a sacred artifact or object of worship. Around the altar were various items that seemed to be used in ancient rituals: old vessels, stone knives, and amulets. Dim light filtered into the cave through narrow cracks, creating a mystical atmosphere, and I felt that each step was filled with mystery and ancient magic. I was sent here to study what this creature was and what it was capable of. So I got to work. Day after day, we conducted experiments, uncovering new information that stirred the mind. Soon, this laboratory was built, and we continued our research until the first case of infection occurred. That's when we realized the blood of this monster contained a virus capable of altering human DNA and transforming them into monsters. Legends and myths were becoming reality, which both frightened and inspired us. One day I noticed the head was still alive. I mean, we had previously discovered that there were signs of life in it, but no consciousness. It was like a vegetable. But then I saw the head responding to my movements. It did so subtly, so I wouldn't notice. This frightened me so much that I couldn't sleep for several days. I couldn't imagine what would happen if this monster woke up. I tried to avoid it, but I didn't realize that my colleague, Leonard Hoffman, was constantly near it. He was a brilliant scientist who developed the antidote serum. Apparently, he either contacted the head or fell under its control. I'm not sure. The important thing is, he intentionally infected himself. This happened on the day the lab owner arrived. All the staff, all the lab personnel, and the owner gathered in the conference room. It was a trap. 15 minutes before the meeting, Leonard asked me to check the monster's head. I went to the lab, while in the conference room a massacre was happening. Leonard locked all the doors and, transforming into a monster, began killing. No one survived. When I returned to the conference room, I saw a pile of bodies. Suddenly, Leonard attacked me in his monstrous form. Luckily, I always carried a weapon designed to repel these creatures, which we had developed earlier. I barely managed to escape. When I returned fully armed, the monster had fled. I didn't know what to do. Reporting this lab to the government could have led to a catastrophe, as the virus in the head's blood is extremely contagious. I decided to shut down the lab and settled nearby, tracking and hunting Leonard. For 30 years I couldn't catch him, but today it finally happened. That's roughly what happened here. But I want to highlight a couple of points. From my observations, Leonard has become much weaker over the years. Their peak strength is at the beginning of the transformation. Secondly, before transforming, they become quite vulnerable, lose their mind, and move purely on instincts, making them almost impossible to find. That's why I didn't let you go. You would have been lost in the depths of this lab. We listened in shock, as if pulled from a science fiction novel. I remembered Emily, recalling how kind and sweet she was, how brightly she smiled, and my heart ached with pain. Dr. Weiss continued, "Now you understand why we need to leave. That head is alive and extremely dangerous, but I must stay and kill the creature your friend has become. After the transformation, they become utterly insane and less cautious, making it a chance to put her out of her misery." He then stood, took his gun, and left. I couldn't believe my ears and rushed after him. "Wait, isn't there a way to cure her? Maybe she can be saved," I asked hopefully. "No, she could only be cured before the transformation. After that, it's impossible," the doctor replied, turning to look at me deeply before placing a hand on my shoulder. "I understand how hard it is to lose someone you care about. But you must accept that the girl you loved is gone. Now go to the exit. I must do my duty." I stood, lost in thought, not knowing what to do. My friends came up to me and said it was time to go. I watched the doctor walk down the corridor. Suddenly, a monster jumped out from an open door and attacked him. It happened so fast that we couldn't react before the professor's head rolled on the ground and blood spurted from his neck. The monster approached the body and stood on its hind legs, roaring. We were paralyzed with fear. The werewolf turned to us, slowly opening its formidable jaws full of sharp giant fangs. Its fur, colored in shades of chestnut like Emily's hair, gently swayed in the airflow from the fan. "God, Emily, what have you become?" I thought sadly. Suddenly the monster lunged at us, and we rushed into the nearest room, slamming the door. There was a loud bang as the door shook. The monster growled in frustration and then went silent. We sighed in relief, but then heard a noise from above. Something was moving through the ventilation system. Then, just a few dozen feet from us, the ventilation grate fell to the floor, and the werewolf jumped out. In panic, we rushed to the door we had just closed. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the lock. Finally, with relief, I heard a click. The door opened. We scattered in different directions. I chose the room across the hall. I didn't see where the others went. My entire world had narrowed to the creature chasing me. It seemed to have chosen me as its target, slamming into the door behind which I was hiding with enormous force. This was the same room where the professor had died. This time, the werewolf wasn't looking for a way through the ventilation. It decided to break down the barrier. I stood there, unable to look away, watching as the creature repeatedly threw itself at the door until it broke through. Not waiting for it to enter, I ran along the shelves. Hiding in a corner, I crouched, trying to quiet my breathing. I felt the presence of the werewolf, its heavy steps causing the walls to shake. With each movement, dust rose into the air. creating ghostly shadows. It seemed I could hear its breathing, low and steady, like the sound of an approaching storm. My heart pounded wildly as I slowly moved from one hiding spot to another, trying not to make any noise. Adrenaline coursed through my veins and fear filled every cell of my body. Suddenly there was a loud noise. The werewolf had found my hiding place. It growled, its eyes glowing in the darkness, reflecting a yellow light like burning coals. It charged forward, smashing everything in its path, its claws scraping against the metal shelves. In desperation, I dashed out of my hiding place, sprinting across the room towards the exit. The werewolf followed, its roar filling the space, making the blood in my veins freeze. I glanced back one last time, seeing the enormous creature breaking through obstacles as if they were made of paper. With the last remnants of my strength, I dashed out of the room, the werewolf hot on my heels, its steps drawing ever closer. A sharp gunshot shattered the silence, once, then again. The monster let out a long howl, full of pain and rage. Turning around, I saw John, armed with the doctor's shotgun, firing at the werewolf. Despite its injuries, the creature lunged at John with incredible speed, knocking him off his feet with a powerful blow. The werewolf slowly approached John like a predator, ready to deliver the final blow. In desperation, I rushed towards them and grabbed the shotgun. The monster paused, meeting my gaze. From behind me, Tyler emerged, shouting for me to shoot. "One shot to the head and it's dead!" His voice sounded like a sentence. But I hesitated. Tyler also had feelings for Emily, and now he was demanding that I kill her. Standing there indecisive, I watched as the werewolf turned its attention back to John. A shot rang out, smoke rising from the barrel of the shotgun. I missed. I didn't want to hit. The werewolf met my gaze, and I swear deep within its eyes I saw that same warm look that belonged to the one I loved. With a roar, the creature dashed into the darkness of the corridor. Exhausted and overwhelmed with emotion, I approached John. He was injured but not mortally, likely with a few broken ribs. I helped him to his feet, draping his arm over my shoulder, and supported him as we walked. Tyler walked beside us, holding the shotgun I had given him, cautiously scanning our surroundings. Soon we left that place. Once we were in the forest and got phone reception, we called for help. After some time, the lab was cordoned off. John was taken to the hospital, and men in strict suits, identifying themselves as FBI agents, began interrogating us. We told everything without holding back, eager to get it over with. In the end, they asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I told them to go to hell. Surprisingly, they didn't push too hard, perhaps thinking that no one would believe such a story anyway. They did, however, confiscate our phones. After we finished all the formalities, I saw Emily's parents in the hallway of the department. They looked very sad, having been told that their daughter had died. I stood at a distance, unable to find the strength to approach them, and confessed that their daughter, having transformed into a monster, was now wandering somewhere in the depths of the forest. Story 4. Edward's awakening was painful. The fog of illusory vision melted away, dripping pain down his temples, giving way to reality. Cruel, roaring silence that pierced his brain with shards of cold, dead glass. He opened his eyes. Everything was as before. The same walls he had stared at before the blackout, the same stone floor he had fallen onto, splitting his brow open and bleeding. The painful loss of consciousness had been a forced measure by his exhausted body. The tension that had accompanied him all these days, it felt like years, pushed his mind to the brink of madness, beyond which lay the solace of insanity. But in his case, madness would not be a salvation. Deep down, he knew that even if he lost his mind, he would continue to see them. It had gone too far. Everyone makes mistakes and everyone pays for them. His presence here, on the cold, moldy floor of an abandoned church, voluntarily locked in, alone, was merely an escape from those who had come to collect the debt for his past sins. Lord, have mercy on those who have erred, who have killed not for protection but for sustenance, those who did not value what they had. No one is without sin, and in this we are equal, the hermit monk and the werewolf whose claws and teeth are stained with blood. Spare us. Let the reckoning come after death. Why now, while I still live? Outside the stone walls of the small church, wolves howled. They whimpered, fought, scratched at the doors. They barked in fits of hungry spasms and convulsions. Then they grew quiet. He heard them digging in the ground. He hoped they would reach him and tear him apart. He couldn't bring himself to end his own life. But his hopes were not to be realized. The wolves were merely digging up graves to feast on the dead human flesh, gnawing it with savage delight under the full moon's light. He rose from the floor. He listened. They weren't there yet. God, how he wished they would never be there again. His name was Edward Foster. That was in a past life, and even then few called him by that name. By his nature, no one was supposed to know his name. People called him and addressed him without names. They simply said, "There's a job," or "We need to meet." And he would come, always to the same place, a quiet, unremarkable restaurant on the corner of 48th Street, where Big Joe sat, invariably with a stinking cigar in his mouth, smoking like a chimney and drinking warm whiskey. And he would sit opposite, without greeting or making foolish comments about how wonderful the day was. He would silently look at the photograph, not asking unnecessary questions. Joe himself said only what needed to be known. Extra information played a bad joke in their line of work. How many of those fatal photographs had he seen? Dozens? Hundreds? He didn't keep count. The only thing to count was the money Joe brought, because even though Joe was an old partner, he often shorted the needed amount by 100 or two. Yes, I was a killer, a hitman. The statues and frescoes looked down at him. Edward leapt at one depicting an old man, raised his fist, but stopped. How foolish it was to fight with stone saints. Yes, I was a killer, Edward whispered again. But I am also a werewolf. I need food, and this idea seemed perfect to me long ago. I eliminate for money and destroy the victims without leaving a trace. But now, whose church was this? Catholic? Protestant? Edward didn't know. For as long as he could remember, he had never entered a church. He thought those who wasted precious time on meaningless chatter with God were fools. You might as well talk to a chair or a wall, they wouldn't hear you either. That's what he thought then. And now, here he was, sitting by a statue. What difference does it make who to believe in, the devil or God, as long as it saves from them? Lord, I am a werewolf. Can you hear me? Wasn't it you who cursed me? But I don't want this anymore. I'm tired. I don't want to be a hitman or a monster anymore. The statue looked at him and frowned. And Edward looked at the old man and couldn't take his eyes off him. A gray old man with ash-covered eyes, holding a book. Damnation. The old man pierced him with his gaze, cutting into his heart, penetrating his very soul. The heavy look ground him in its millstones, and Edward couldn't hold back. He grabbed his head and began to sob. It became easier. How ironic. I'm seeking refuge from the dead in a church, he whispered. Edward picked up a stone lying on the floor. a piece of plaster, and hurled it at the church ceiling. I don't believe in God. I don't want to believe in him. He screamed again, started punching the walls. Then he calmed down, slid to the dusty floor like a piece of wet paint. Joe, that fat bastard. It's his fault. He's the one who called me every time saying we needed to meet. And then he'd pull a photo out of his pocket and I'd look at it, memorizing. The face mattered. Names, addresses, habits. They were all secondary. The face. It's what I had to remember. By the face, you can determine all a person's habits. I'd look and already know that this one, he's a big company owner, he has a mistress, and he's a collector. And this one, he's sloppy, he doesn't care about anything but himself and the perversions he loves. And so on. And the last one was a doctor. I figured that out too. Doctors have faces like old books. Behind an unassuming cover are many words, clever, specific. It's hard to explain in words. You can only feel it. It's my monster nature. I feel and see through people. And I would transform into my beastly form and wander the city. Just wander. With the victim's portrait in front of my eyes. 2, 3 days, sometimes a week, and I'd find him. Joe rarely gave me the victim's address, only when the job needed to be done quickly. Mostly I acted this way. But there were exceptions. Sometimes I had to run myself, but I always completed the job. I'd been shot more than once. 2 bullet wounds on my left leg, a scar on my right arm. The victim's security, a hole in my side. From a silver knife, fools thinking they could kill a werewolf with a silver knife. But something always helped me, and I survived. And after all I've seen and done, I'm supposed to believe in God. I am my own God. Only I can help myself, and no one else cares about me but myself. The wolves howled again outside, whimpering and wheezing. And I am one of them, Edward whispered, suddenly enlightened. I am a wolf, cleaning up the rotten meat in society. Every one of those I killed was like a rotting piece of meat. They spread disease. They preyed on ordinary people, wallowed in vice. I am a surgeon, excising a tumor. Henry, I remember that bastard. I called him that, another victim. But I didn't know his real name, nor did I want to. He looked like a gnawed cat's spine. Joe ordered him last winter. I immediately understood from the photograph, from his shiny pink baby-like face, that he was one of those, sick in the head. Tracking him down wasn't difficult. People of that type think alike. Edward turned towards the clerestory window, wanting to walk to the cobweb-covered altar, but he couldn't. His legs, losing control, stumbled over each other, and Edward collapsed to the floor. The last thing that flashed through his mind before he sank into the twilight of unconsciousness was, "Lizzie, I tried to kill her quickly to spare her pain." It all started with a cold. His bones ached, a fever set in. Before, he never noticed any tendency towards illness. Monsters had good immunity. But lately he had felt unwell. Perhaps the body's boundless reserves were running out. And this last job knocked him out of his groove. A young girl whom Why did he take on this job at all? Yes, they paid 3 times more. But didn't he already have money? What was the real reason? To kill the girl? This was the first time for him. Maybe to test himself, to probe that boundary he couldn't cross. He completed the task, cold-bloodedly, as was expected. But 2 days later, he fell ill. And that's when he first heard the voices. Edward lay on the couch, flipping through the TV channels. His head was spinning from the strong painkillers mixed with fever reducers. The screen, from frequent switching, turned into a bizarre color whirl. Snatched words from previous channels overlaid images from others, creating nonsense worse than soap operas. Turning off the TV, Edward tried to sleep, but he couldn't. Something called to him. Edward opened his eyes. Had he dozed off? He listened. Silence. He didn't have his own home. It was safer that way. From time to time, he changed motels, staying in each no more than a month. In some, he stayed a week. In others, he lingered longer. His last refuge was the Mouse House, named either for its gray color, in which everything here was painted, from the walls and ceiling to the night lamps, or because in every room mouse holes were visible in the corners, and at night the rustling and squeaking of the little creatures were all-encompassing and drove him crazy. But Edward didn't complain. The motel was on the edge of the city and was the kind of hole where people came only for one night, to spend the night on a journey or to spend it with a prostitute bought right there. Against the background of constantly changing faces, he was unnoticed, and no one tried to delve into his life. Edward. The voice again. Edward got up. Was the voice coming from the bathroom? It was hard to tell. His head buzzed from the fever. Edward? It repeated. Definitely from the bathroom. Edward went into the bathroom, looked around. No one. He pressed his ear to the wall. Maybe neighbors in another room were calling him. Edward! The voice now came not from the bathroom, from the room. Edward stepped out. He unsheathed his claws, partially transforming into a werewolf. Who are you? He asked the emptiness. You know me. Edward turned sharply. The voice seemed to be playing with him. It sounded from different places. Where are you? Edward whispered, tensing and expecting the voice to come from somewhere. The wall, the voice moaned. Is this some prank by Big Joe? Edward thought. Tony, I'll rip your throat out. Know that I don't like being played with. Where did you hide the microphone, or whatever you have? You're funny. Joe, is he your friend? We know nothing about him. Come out. I'm counting to 3. We can't come out. We're in the wall. In the wall? Edward looked at the walls. The wall near your blood. We are there. You better be packing your things right now and getting far away. Otherwise, I'll find you and tear you apart, Edward thought, approaching the wall. Where are you hiding the microphone? We're in the wall. Edward tapped his claws on the partition. A hollow echo rolled to the floor. A stronger blow punched a hole in it. Edward began tearing off the drywall, throwing it aside, looking for what was making the sound and mocking him. Free us. I'll cut your ears off, filthy scum. Are you playing with me? Tired of living? Free us, the voice full of pain and suffering repeated. The rising dust got into his eyes and nose, making him want to sneeze. The disfigured room now looked more like the abode of a giant rat than a person. Opposite the doors in the wall was a hollowed-out hole, as if meant for a mutant rodent from 1950s horror films, which Edward watched with relish as a child. Edward stepped aside, letting the construction dust settle. Where are you? He asked, peering into the haze. Here, look. And through the dusty veil, Edward saw who owned the voice. A human corpse was walled up in the wall. His bluish-white skin, cloudy eyes covered with plaster dust, and dead, dry hair falling onto his forehead. All this caught Edward's eye and scorched his mind. Edward opened his mouth in surprise. It was not so much the fact that there was a corpse in his room wall that surprised him, but that Edward knew him. Brad. The owner of a small shop and somehow connected to the mafia and slipped up on something. Edward was ordered to kill him 6 months ago. He slit his throat with his claws, forever silencing his restless nature. What the... I have returned to you, Brad said, stepping out of the hole in the wall. I am now part of you. You ate me. Edward fully transformed into a werewolf and ferociously attacked the corpse. He slashed at it, struck with all his might. Brad looked at the claw marks on his belly, glanced at Edward, and burst out laughing. The werewolf, on the contrary, saw nothing funny in it. "I have surprises for you." The dead man pointed a finger at the opposite wall. Edward turned, but kept Brad in his peripheral vision. People slowly emerged from the wall Brad pointed to, and they were all familiar. Edward swallowed a lump that had risen to his throat. His dead. Those he had killed. I fell asleep. I fell asleep by the TV, flashed through his mind. They're probably showing something creepy on TV and I'm asleep, and it seems... A powerful punch to the jaw snapped Edward out of his stupor. Brad possessed incredible strength. Even a werewolf was no match for him. Rising from the floor and spitting out bloody saliva, Edward darted to the opposite wall. "Come to us!" the dead yelled, slowly surrounding him in a tight, foul-smelling ring. The werewolf began striking those corpses that came too close. The dead only laughed from the wounds they received, as if instead of claws, Edward had a goose feather with which he tickled the rotting sides of the corpses. And this angered Edward. He shoved one of the dead away and tried to break through the ring surrounding him. A foul smell of decay hit his nose. The guests did not let him go. They grabbed his hands and legs and dragged him to the hole from which Brad had appeared. Edward had never had to call for help, and now he hesitated until they squeezed him into the narrow passage and began sealing the hole with something sticky, smelly, like thickened oil spewed from the mouths of the corpses. "Hey! Help! Someone hear me! Help!" Edward shouted. Until the last moment, he hoped it was just a nightmare brought on by the drugs. But the dead acted quickly, and in an instant, the hole in the wall was almost completely sealed. Only Edward's head peered out into the room. Edward tried to tear this thickening, viscous substance apart, but only scratched his paws on the embedded sharp stones. Feeling them with his palm, he realized in horror that they were pieces of someone's teeth. The dead moved back, watching as if a brigade of workers inspecting their completed task. There was a knock at the door. "Are you all right in there?" asked someone. Edward recognized the manager's voice. The dead turned towards the knocks, then began approaching the wall next to Edward and dissolving, leaving damp spots that smelled of mold and dampness on the gray wallpaper. The last one to leave Edward's room was Brad. "We will return," he promised with a smile. And he vanished. And along with him, the sticky substance holding Edward disappeared. Edward stood in the gaping hole in the wall, like in an elevator, clutching the void with his bloodied fingers. A second ago, it had been a piece of goo. "Hey, are you okay?" The knock came again. Seems like not, Edward thought. He transformed back into a human as he approached the door, opening the door just enough to stick his head through, and with a trembling voice and stumbling words, he explained that everything was fine. He just had a bad dream. The manager looked at Edward with suspicion. "I heard a lot of loud noise and animal growls. Do you have pets in there?" "It was the TV." Edward laughed nervously. "Volume was on max. Everything is fine, thanks for checking." And Edward shut the door. The sound of the manager's retreating steps calmed him, but only for a while, until he heard behind him again, "We will return." Edward turned sharply, almost twisting his neck, but saw no one. The room was empty. His head, on the other hand, was bursting with thoughts. The next morning, after a sleepless night, they returned again. A hissing sound like a red-hot brand searing and peeling flesh from bare bone echoed near his ear. "The wind brings oblivion, my friend. We just need to conquer our fear," a quiet voice said. "The wind brings oblivion, my friend. We just need to conquer our fear," another voice repeated. and everything spun in a mad dance of insanity. Voices, there were no fewer than 1,000, screamed, whispered, moaned the same lines, merging into a stormy squall. Edward covered his ears, but it didn't help. Sharp needles of madness pierced his brain, and it felt like his head would explode from the gravel of words filling it. "Enough! Stop it!" the man shouted, contorting in pain. Minutes stretched like drying tar, then stopped altogether, were torture for Edward. The voices drove him insane, as if an axe was splitting his head, making him rush from corner to corner. Then night fell, bringing no respite. What happened in the morning seemed like child's play compared to what unfolded before him now. To the voices were added visual hallucinations. Or were they not hallucinations at all? The dead floated out of the walls, walked around him, then pounced, tore at him, scratched out his eyes, ripped out his hair, sank their teeth into his body. Pain wasn't as terrifying a punishment compared to their eyes, which drilled into him, penetrated his soul, and there, like worms, gnawed tunnels to his spine and up to his brain. Madness throbbed in his temples, ready to burst through the thin partition of his skull. And then he couldn't take it anymore. He ran out of the house without looking back, through the deserted pre-dawn streets, past empty gas stations and trash cans. The wind whistled in his ears, and his entire body was chilled by the drafts, but he didn't notice. Running was the only escape from this nightmare. Then the urban landscape began to dissolve into natural scenery. Trees and bushes started to appear. Houses and cars disappeared. Somewhere behind him the road turned off. The voices stayed behind there as well. Edward stopped. He listened. It was quiet, but only for a moment. Familiar ghostly words echoed distantly, and the man realized that he could not escape. They would catch up with him. Panic enveloped him, and he rushed up the hill, past the old abandoned cemetery, to the place where a dilapidated, time-worn church stood. "Lizzie? We have returned," said a young girl standing in the middle of the hall. Her face, white as if sculpted from plaster, stared at Edward. In the corner of her mouth a trickle of dried blood. Her neck, slightly askew, crunched when she turned her head. Edward shivered. "We?" "All those you killed," she explained. The girl smiled, and there was nothing alive in that smile. They had returned. The dead who had been chasing him had retreated for a while when he took refuge in the church. But even the holy sanctuary could not save him from the ghosts for long. The first one he saw again after a brief respite was Lizzie, the dead girl who sometimes appeared in his nightmares. "What? What do you want from me? Go away, do you hear? Go away. We have a gift for you." Lizzie stepped back, pointing to the altar where a translucent silhouette stood. And in those outlines Edward, try as he might, still recognized a familiar figure. "Uncle Frank? Little Eddie, you've been bad. You're a ghost, you're a ghost, you're a ghost." "Ghost, ghost," the silhouette echoed, smirking. "You're not real, you're... Lizzie told me everything about you. How naughty you've been. A disobedient, headstrong boy." The ghost started slowly approaching Edward. The blurred details became sharper, and from the mist emerged a face, grinning with huge, caterpillar-like lips, shaggy eyebrows sticking out, under which small black eyes nestled, and a tuft of unkempt stiff hair under the nose, a mustache. His uncle, the alpha werewolf, cruel and strong. Edward pushed away the unpleasant memory. "Uncle Frank? That's a lie. I didn't do anything like that." His voice wavered, turning from the rough adult tone to a thin child's falsetto. "Don't lie to me." No, Uncle Frank, no." The dead man drew closer to Edward, slowly unbuckling his belt. "You'll thank me later, kid. I'll make a man out of you. A real werewolf. So why are you standing there? Take off your pants." "It's a dream. A dream." Edward rushed to the side, pressing himself into the corner. "You little brat! Just like last time. Running away again." "I killed you. Killed you, you vile scum. I fought for power. I am a free werewolf," Edward hissed. The ghost paused as if contemplating Edward's words. "Yes, you killed me. I know, little Eddie, I don't blame you for that. Only myself, because I didn't discipline you enough." "Don't be afraid," Frank reassured him, pulling the belt from the loops of his pants. He began to twist it into a tight loop. Light flooded his eyes, blindingly painful. And with it came memories, bitter as wormwood. Or was it a dream? Edward had once forced himself to believe it was just a nightmare, forgotten by morning. But memory had retrieved it from its deepest recesses, cleaned it, refreshed the colors, and spread it across the church floor, as if playing this film for the first time. Uncle Frank holds the belt. The leather belt creaks like a dead man's tendon. Little Eddie with scraped knees. He fought with a classmate. They couldn't share an item they found, an old baseball glove, probably lost by someone or simply thrown away due to numerous holes and wear. "Come here," Uncle Frank says, his voice steely. "They live with Uncle Frank. There's no father. Mother says he is a test pilot and traveler, and now he's flown far north where it's cold to study animals. Uncle Frank claims the father left them, that the wretched mutt doesn't want to live in the pack like the other werewolves. Uncle Frank took them in, but little Eddie doesn't want to live with him." "Come here," Uncle Frank repeats. His eyes are red like a bull's, and he smells of alcohol and wet dog. "What, Uncle Frank?" the boy asks, but doesn't approach. "Come here," Uncle Frank barks. The frightened boy steps closer to him. "What?" Eddie whispers. "Richie's mom called me. You busted his lip? You want other people to find out about us, so they can call us monsters and burn us at the stake?" No. Eddie was surprised. "Don't lie to me." "We just couldn't share the glove," little Eddie whispers, lowering his eyes. "The glove?" Uncle Frank gets more agitated. His voice turns into a hiss. His hands grab the boy. The man begins to transform into a werewolf. "Uncle Frank, let me go." The boy struggles in the strong arms of the drunken beast, but he doesn't let go. He bares his claws and punishes Edward, painfully, cruelly, as is customary in their pack. No, 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 no. Edward broke into a gallop, running along the church wall, unable to bear the sight of the face he had tried so hard to forget. "Little Eddie, let's have a fight like the old days. Don't call me that. I killed you. I killed you." The echo of his breaking scream shot up, like an explosion, to the church dome, echoing off the remaining intact windows and stained glass. Edward looked around the hall. The church was empty. Where Lizzie had stood lay only a piece of plaster and piles of dust. Where Frank had stood, the wind whistled through. Edward descended from the altar and nearly stumbled. He twisted his ankle but remained on his feet. The pain cleared his mind. His brain, throbbing with tension, squeezed his eardrums out of his ears. The ghosts had found him even here. Hiding in the church was pointless now. They left, but they would return. It was a matter of minutes. He needed to get out of the church. A realization dawned on him. There was no escaping them. Nowhere. Nothing could stop them. They would always pursue him. "I have a gun," Edward thought. "In that room, there's a gun with a special bullet. I'll blow my brains out." And Edward laughed, as if he'd heard a good joke. "Keys?" Where did I throw the keys?" Edward looked around, fell to his knees, and started searching the floor for the keys. Where? Where did I throw them? He needed to calm down. Take a breath. The ghosts weren't here yet. Focus and remember. I ran out of the house, ran past the cemetery, saw the abandoned church, went inside, closed the door. There was a rusty lock with a key on the door. I locked the door automatically and threw the key. I need to find it. In the dim moonlight, Edward searched the floor. They must be here somewhere. His hand felt something soft and cloth-like. Edward brought it closer to his face to see and threw it away in disgust. It was a baseball glove. Old, tattered, with the initials EF. A glove from the past. The keys were nowhere to be found. Edward's search grew less fervent as he realized he wouldn't find them. Finally, unable to take it anymore, he stood up and approached the door. He tugged at the heavy lock. Old, maybe older than the church itself, riveted, adorned with a pattern that was hard to make out through the blooming rust. How did it even still work? Maybe it didn't anymore. The moment he locked it was the last straw for the iron mechanism, and it had forever exhausted its reliability, sealing its jaws shut and condemning Edward to eternal imprisonment in the church, alone with the dead. Stepping back a few steps, Edward ran and slammed his shoulder into the door. It merely groaned, clanging against the hinge. Another attempt brought unbearable pain to his shoulder. Kicking the boards didn't work either. The door clanged with the lock, not letting in even a sliver of freedom. Damn it. What kind of curse is this? I'm a werewolf. Why can't I break down the door? Damn ghosts, Edward swore and stepped back. Find the key. Edward turned. The voice was childlike, but not Lizzie's. It belonged to someone standing in the dim light near the holy water font. Squinting, Edward saw familiar clothes on the boy and screamed. His voice was gone. A rasp like barbed wire scorched his throat, spilling out like a dead snake. Standing before him was himself, holding a baseball glove. Only a hint of gray hair and a few scars on his face distinguished adult Edward from his childhood self. He hadn't changed much over the years. I'm not dead yet. You can't be my ghost, Edward rasped, looking at himself as if at a photo taken many years ago and well preserved. Don't be afraid. I'll help you, because I am you. No, Edward laughed. You are not me, and I am not you. I'm still alive. The ghost ignored his laughter. The key is by that wall. Take it. Edward laughed louder. Fits of laughter burst out like spasms. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Just like that. The key is over there. Go and take it. I must be going mad. But where is the relief? Do you want to get out of here? The ghosts won't let you go. But at home, there's a gun and a special bullet. It'll save you. I just want to help you. The key is there. Go and take it. Still chuckling, Edward slowly approached the spot the boy pointed to, knelt down, and began searching for the key, muttering through his laughter. He found it immediately. The cold steel felt good in his hand. Run! They'll be back soon, very soon. Hurry! Thank you, Edward rasped and ran to the door. He tried to open it frantically. The madness in his eyes was gone. There was a spark of hope. His hands trembled. The key, as if alive, refused to fit into the lock. Damn it, Edward swore, dropping the key in his nervousness. He picked it up, but before he could try again, a dead man appeared before him, the last of those he had sent to the afterlife. The doctor. His watery eyes stared at Edward. You dropped something, the ghost said, and handed Edward a handful of keys. They clinked as they fell through his fingers. Edward looked at the floor. It was impossible to tell which key was for the lock on the front door. They were all mixed, turning into a pile of useless metal. A wave of rage washed over his mind. He swung for a punch but couldn't hit. The invisible shackles held his body against the wall. "Do you smoke?" the doctor asked. "What? Do you smoke?" Edward was taken aback by the question, especially from a ghost. "No, I don't." "That's good. Did you know that smoking is one of the leading causes of lung cancer?" "If I knew, I would have smoked. A lot and for a long time. Just not to see all that I've seen here over the last—" Edward paused. How long had he been there? An hour? 2? A day? A week? "Over the last day," the doctor clarified, glancing at his watch. "What do you want to do to me?" Edward asked, looking at his hands that seemed chained to the wall by invisible manacles. "Do you like tea?" The doctor ignored Edward's question. "Go to hell." "I like it. Green tea. Very healthy. I recommend it." "Hey, doctor. Explain to me. What's going on here? Am I insane? Is that it?" "Fortunately, no. My observations suggest with 90% certainty that you're sane." "Sane?" Edward chuckled. "A dead man tells me I'm sane." "Dead because of you." The doctor bared his teeth. "Yes, I killed you. Tore you apart with my claws. So what? Everyone gets what they deserve. You treat people and get paid for it. I kill and eat people and get paid for it too. That's life." "And why did you kill me?" "Personally, I have no grudge against you. I don't care who you are or what you do. An order came in. I fulfilled it. Seek your true killer, the one who wanted you dead. I was just the tool of execution in his hands." "Maybe it's connected to my work?" the doctor asked himself. Behind the doctor, 2 figures appeared in the distance. Edward squinted, trying to make them out. One was Frank. He couldn't remember the other. Familiar features gate, but the face was veiled. "You're a doctor. Who would pay huge sums to kill you?" Edward asked. "Maybe you treated someone poorly and they died? Revenge of relatives?" "You know, I'm a doctor, but not quite in the field you think. I don't treat people. I worked in a secret government lab, Division N16. They were developing various substances for conducting silent wars. Tanks and gunfire are things of the past. It's much more financially advantageous to wage wars without expensive equipment. Planes, missiles, shells, and without losing human resources. The ideal war. The enemy does all the work for you. You drop a new kind of bacteria into enemy territory, and it devours the enemy from within. Those you want to defeat, in a frenzy of madness, kill themselves. 1, 2 days, and the victor, of course, vaccinated against this infection, enters the city strewn with bodies. The corpses are burned, the streets are disinfected, without a single shot. Isn't it great? And after this, I'm the killer? Doctor, you're scarier than I am? Your hands are stained with the blood of millions? You're naive. It's still in development. Of course, such a weapon hasn't been invented yet. But I'm working on it. Worked on it. Maybe I crossed someone. The figures behind the doctor discussed something among themselves. Frank laughed loudly. His companion patted him on the shoulder, and Edward finally recognized him. It was Brad. "Little Eddie," Frank waved. "Come to us," Brad said, smirking. "Are those your friends?" the doctor asked, turning around. "They're my nightmares. Little Eddie, we have a surprise for you. Look." Frank pointed to the side, and there, as if by magic, appeared a butcher's table. And on it, Edward couldn't bear to look. "Why are you turning away, Eddie? Your friend Brad has a gift for you." On the table, in a similar pose to Edward's current one, lay a child, a boy, the one everyone used to call just Eddie. "I'll cut off his head," Frank roared, pulling a crooked knife from its sheath. Wait, let's enjoy his pain first. Brad knew his job. A scalpel gleamed in his hands. Don't touch him. Come to me, Edward shouted. We'll definitely come to you, don't worry. Go away! Edward yanked once more. Something cracked in his wrist. Burning pain seared his left hand. The shackles gave way, freeing his path. With a mad cry, he ran towards the maniacs, but a light draft blew away the mirage. No one was there. The dust raised squeaked on his teeth. Edward collapsed to the floor. The throbbing pain in his hand grew, and he realized with horror that it was broken. His wrist was swollen, aching like a rotten tooth, sending explosive pain with the slightest movement. I am you. You. The belated echo echoed through the church's arches. Edward shivered at the sound of the voice, shouted a few curse words to drown it out. The words, like birds that had flown into a room, flapped frantically against the walls. They landed again on his prematurely gray, now snow-white head. There were no more thoughts. He had crossed the threshold beyond which nothing mattered anymore. It seemed that even the pain wouldn't bring him back. Tranquility, like cotton wool, enveloped him. The white oblivion plunged him into the warmth of emptiness. He was neither falling asleep nor fainting. He was simply lying somewhere in another reality. He wanted to stop breathing, so as not to hear the annoying wheeze. And his heart. It was still beating, knocking the silence out from under him. The heartbeat brought him back to this reality, where he lay, completely gray, with a broken wrist, in pants wet with urine, exhausted on the damp, moldy floor of an abandoned church, in a place where God had left and where he had hidden, hoping to find salvation. Salvation had flicked its tail, offering false hope. Time became his main enemy. Under the statues, in a wheelchair, sat an old woman. Her gray hair spread across her shoulders. She was whispering something, praying. Close your eyes and ears, and hide as far away as possible, in the farthest corner, to neither see nor hear what was unfolding before him. Edward couldn't do it. Either his body wouldn't obey him, or some part of him didn't want to. He stared at the old woman, unable to look away. Her frail, dry hands rested on the gray blanket covering her legs. Gnarled, arthritic fingers trembled. She was dressed very strangely. A clearly men's shirt, resembling a prisoner's uniform without pockets or buttons, only Velcro. On her chest, Edward made out a patch, County Psychiatric Hospital, and below that, crudely written in permanent marker, Anna Forster. "Mom?" Edward asked, astonished, approaching the old woman. She raised her head and looked at him with cataract-clouded eyes. "Beans for lunch again today. I hate beans. Leave me alone." "Mom," Edward called again. "That young nurse is stealing my things. I know it. She gives me pills and steals. Cut off her head." "Mom, it's me. Edward, your son." The old woman looked intently at the figure standing before her. "Edward?" she repeated. "Yes, I remember. The birth was difficult. The doctor said they had to cut off my arm. I refused. Do you understand? I was under hypnosis. He gave me an injection and I couldn't move. And he kept coming on to me. He extracted the fetus with iron forceps." The old woman was mad. Edward recoiled from her, but guilt wouldn't let him leave. He had fled from his mother that ill-fated day when Frank's life ended. He ran because he didn't know what to say to her when she saw the beheaded body of their relative. And he never saw her again. He lived for a month near his childhood home in basements and sewers, once even sneaking in through a window for food during the day when no one was home. But he never saw his mother. He didn't want to see her. He was afraid. And then living there where everything reminded him of those events became unbearable. So he left, hitchhiking north. He was good at lying. Made up stories about visiting a sick father or a school bus breaking down on a picnic. And he got lost after wandering too far from the group. People believed him and helped. Some even gave him money. "You're not here. It means you're still alive, silly boy," said the old woman. And her voice, which had been creaky with age, turned into that familiar voice he hadn't heard in 30 years. His heart ached. Exhaustion fell on him like a heavy sack. Edward sank to the floor and began to cry, bitterly, desperately, trying to weep away all the sins he had committed. The moan poured out, breaking into a scream and a howl. It didn't take a genius to understand what had happened to his mother after his escape. It came to him like a revelation. She returned from work, exhausted from monotonous hard labor. Her shoulders ached. Her back was sore. The door was unlocked. And that scared her. Frank drank a lot, and little Edward was too young. Bad people could have broken in. But what she saw when she entered the house and the unusual silence cut her ears, forever changed her life. Frank's room was covered in blood. The walls, the bed, the floor. Everything was drenched in dark, dried blood. And on the bed, one leg hanging over the floor as if about to get up, lay dead Frank, headless. Anna wanted to scream, but her breath was taken away by wild animal fear and revulsion. The severed head lay on the floor like a curled up and sleeping cat. The glossy black circle of the neck's cut. Dried blood splatters forming horrible hieroglyphs of death on the walls. At that moment, something irreversible happened. Her sense of reality forever changed. In her head, it was like a switch had clicked. Someone turned off the light, then turned it back on, but it shone differently. She fainted beside the head, face to face with the one she had secretly hated, but never allowed herself to think about his death. Frank had saved them, given them shelter. When she came to, the first thing she saw was him, his head. She remembered nothing after that. Consciousness returned to her in fragments. A hospital room, an investigator asking her something, slapping her face, while the orderly looked away in shame, trying not to notice. Then a saving void. The eternal prisoners of their minds, the mad, the violent, attacking the orderlies, biting their own flesh and the quiet ones, monotonously mumbling nonsense in the corners of the corridor. Lunch. An orderly with a syringe. God, how she hated injections since childhood. And again the void. Someone's cries, mad, desperate. Someone being beaten with sticks. Night. Full moon. It would be restless again tonight. The black, viscous dream would be filled with nightmares. Horrible, frightening, making her jump out of bed and scream. But she had to hold back the scream. Orderlies always came at the sound of screams and gave injections. After injections, waking up was impossible, and the sleep lasted forever. Outside the window, spring quickly turned into summer. Summer heated the walls and left. Autumn poured acid on the trees, causing them to shed and contort, and the century-old winter began. Little Eddie, your mother rotted in a mental hospital. And it was you who put her there, Frank shouted joyfully, baring sharp teeth. No, Edward whispered, looking into the mad eyes of the old woman. Yes, my boy, yes. Look at her. Frank approached the old woman, gently adjusted the blanket on her lap, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She waited for you, Edward. Hoped you would come and take her away. Frank checked the sharpness of the knife with his finger. And you abandoned her. Alone. Little Eddie, look here. Edward squeezed his eyes shut, covered his ears with his hands. Stupid boy. Behaved badly and now wants to avoid punishment. How disgraceful. Little Eddie, you abandoned your pack. And look what happened to your mother." Uncle turned into a werewolf and struck Edward forcefully. The last thing Edward remembered was the dull sound of a head rolling away, like a bowling ball thrown accurately at the pins. Tearing the eyelids of unconsciousness, the first thing he felt was the taste of copper on his lips. It took no more than 2 seconds, which felt like hours, to realize it was blood. Opening his eyes and looking around, he felt a wave of shock engulf his mind, causing nauseous reflexes and weakness throughout his body. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, on the statues. Everything was splattered with red. Edward sat up, and a second wave of revulsion hit him, forcing him to use all his strength to hold back the vomit that was bursting out. Nearby lay bloody, battered baseball gloves. "Come to us," a familiar voice sounded. Edward looked towards the end of the hall. There, by the altar, stood a human figure. Obeying the command without question, Edward moved towards it, leaving bloody streaks behind. "You are tired, my son," said the figure standing before him. "Father," Edward exhaled. "Yes, my son. I am tired. We will take you." Tears rolled down Edward's cheeks. "Dad, you left us. I don't even know what you look like." The figure before him smiled. He couldn't see the smile because it was impossible to see it on the smooth, faceless oval that was its head. But Edward felt his father smile. "Dad, why are they haunting me?" "You know the answer, son? They're driving me insane." "Calm down, son. It's over. I came for you." "We came for you," said his mother. "Came for you," echoed disjointed voices from all sides. The dead, all those he had killed, the doctor, Brad, Lizzie, Frank, and thousands of faces he no longer remembered, stood along the walls of the church, and their pale white silhouettes made it seem as if everything around was covered in snow. Edward smiled. "You came for me? Then take me." And the dead moved towards him, surrounding him in a tight ring of death. A piercing scream rose to the church's dome, turning into a rasping whisper. Then silence fell. Part 2. The Diary. November 9th, 1995. My sick imagination draws living pictures for me. Zombies, gnawed, half-decayed corpses, the dead rising from their graves. Funny. And what then? Even God doesn't know. Ah, what God? There is no God. I proved that. The wounds are healing. My fingers are already bending. My pinky finger was less fortunate. The tendons were damaged and now it's useless. I can't move it. But that's nothing. The main thing is I managed to get the reagents. Where they dripped when I carelessly opened them, there are festering sores that won't heal. I need to be more careful. November 10th, 1995. The preparation took much more time than I expected. But I have only one chance, so it's better not to rush. A mistake means defeat. There's too much at stake. I'm waiting for the leaching process to finish. November 12th, 1995. I walked around the city a lot. I still can't get used to so many people. It seems like everyone is looking only at me. Herd creatures, they live by the principle of us versus them. They make me sick. In my coat pocket, I clutched a revolver. It took all my restraint not to pull it out and start shooting into the faces of the first people I saw. The world became empty without you, Father. November 17th, 1995. Father made my job easier. Everything in his diaries, all his notes about T4, he didn't encrypt. Although he had a penchant for such things, his personal diary is entirely written in hieroglyphs. But I deciphered them. Back in my youth. Heredity, intelligence. Father would have been proud of me. after he scolded and whipped me with a belt. Moreover, part of the ingredients was in the home lab. But there was still work to be done. To get vanadium oxide, I had to sacrifice a pinky finger and a festering rib. November 19th, 1995. From Father's Notes. After administering T4 orally in a dose of 0.05 milliliters to the test subject, the following symptoms are observed. Increased body temperature, up to 38 degrees C, sweating, nervousness. Auditory hallucinations appear. Increasing the dose to 0.07 milliliters causes severe visual and auditory hallucinations. Speech remains unimpaired. Aggression alternates with severe fear attacks. After 30 minutes, symptoms of severe mental damage appear. All the subject's attempts result in suicide. How wonderful. Just what I need. This monster cannot be killed with ordinary weapons. I must be careful. Werewolves exist, and one of them killed my father. November 21st, 1995. The final stage of my revenge is approaching. How long I've waited. This beast will pay for my father's death. I searched for it. Searched for a long time. Spent all my savings, bribed people. Killed. The thread led me to someone named Tony. What a freak he is. He didn't take the money. Well, worse for him. The number of cut-off fingers is directly proportional to the truth you want to know. Tony needed 5. His death was quick. He didn't suffer. But I learned all the details. It's very close. Very close. November 25th, 1995. The hour has come. Today, revenge will be fulfilled. Ah, this cold dish, and I will savor it to the last crumb. And then I'll put a bullet in my temple. Father, soon. I'm coming to you. Part 3. The next morning. It wasn't crowded near the abandoned church. 2 medical examiners and a police officer were questioning the terrified witnesses. 2 teenagers no older than 15. Officer Campton got out of the car, inhaled the cold morning air through his nostrils, and yawned widely. The approaching assistant also wasn't fully awake. He looked disheveled and smelled of booze. "What do we have?" Campton asked, rubbing his eyes and turning his nose away from the assistant. "A man's body. The teenagers found him in the church when they came to play there." "Playing in a church?" Campton was surprised. "Youth. New generation. Different morals," sighed the assistant, licking his dry, chapped lips. "Any theories?" Campton asked. The man shrugged, handing him a sheet of paper. The preliminary examination report prepared by the medical examiner. The officer took the report, skimmed it, found the needed section, and read aloud. Presumably, death occurred from strangulation. Marks of fingers with 8 oval shapes are visible on the neck. Near the left carotid artery, against the background of the bruise, arcuate strip-like abrasions from nails are visible. Looking expressively at the bustling medical examiner nearby, he loudly asked, "What does this even mean? Can't you write in plain language?" "If to convey the general meaning." The assistant adjusted his glasses that had slid down his nose. "The death occurred from suffocation. He strangled himself. Is that even possible? The medical examiner must have made a mistake. It's impossible to strangle oneself, of course." The officer looked at the body. The dead man's face was twisted in a grimace of terror. His hands clutched his own neck with such fury that blue veins stood out. Did the man strangle himself? Campton shook his head, cursing the inept staff under his breath. "Officer Campton," another policeman shouted, running out from the underbrush and waving his hands. "We've got another body. Behind the church, in the bushes. Suicide, shot himself." Officer Campton sighed heavily. The new day wasn't starting off well.